It's just loading. Yeah, there we go.
Perfect. So welcome everybody. Welcome to our social life cycle assessment training. It's a pleasure having you all with us. My name is Dalia. I'm the Director of Studies of the Research School for Sustainable Systems for Food, Energy, and Biomaterials. The aim of our research school is to offer knowledge and insights in the technical, environmental, economic, and social aspects of sustainable systems. Our research school has members from 4 different departments at SLU: Energy and Technology, Molecular Sciences, Economics, Crop Production, Ecology. We offer a number of courses for our PhD students and postdocs. You can check out the available courses at our website. And we also offer a number of seminars, workshops, and summer schools. This workshop today is organized by our research school, and it is one of our activities. For today's agenda, we're going to start this session with the basics of social life cycle assessment, and the upcoming session will be about finding social hotspots. I would like to welcome our speakers. Welcome, Mark and Janek. It's a pleasure having you with us, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Dalia. Okay, I will share my screen and then I will. Yeah.
And we are now sharing one camera because I wanted to use another computer as normal for Sima Pro, but that one suddenly doesn't connect to the internet. So I'll be off a little bit again later to try to fix that problem.
No worries, it happens all the time.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. See if there's a way to try. Okay. Okay, great. Welcome everyone. Good to see all of your faces. So of course, Mark and I will be instructing these 2 sessions for you today on social LCA training. And I thought we would start with some house rules. So firstly, can you hear us well? And it would be nice to see some thumbs up or some indication that our voices are clear. Yeah, great. And we will be trying to take breaks about every 45 minutes. We know it's a lot of new information to take in. So it would be good to rest our brains a little bit. So we'll try to keep our talking to as short a time as possible, try to make it interactive and also try to take some breaks. And of course, we prefer to see your faces. It's also always nice to have an engaged group where we can have open discussions and talk amongst ourselves. But we also understand if you do not wish to leave your camera on. But please, if you do ask a question, please raise your hand and indicate to us and put your video feed on when you ask the question. That would be great. And then the last point is let us know how we can do better. So of course, this is a course where there's a lot of one-way information, but we do want some responses and engagement from your side, and do let us know how we can do better. Lastly, just a tip that these orange boxes that come up will indicate an opportunity to respond or to share or to comment. And yeah, we also want to learn from you, and such is social impact, is that we all learn from each other's case studies and each other's perspectives and thoughts. So we really want to stress that in this session. So firstly, a welcome. So today we will go over, in the first session, the basics of social LCA and some challenges and comparisons with environmental LCA. And in the second session, we will look at specifically finding social hotspots and using the social hotspot database in Sima Pro. So I'll first let Mark introduce himself and then take over from there.
Yes, so Good morning, Mark Goedkoop. I've been starting Prey in around 1990. At that time, by the way, I had a lot of collaboration with Swedish people who also developed LCA, were quite pioneering at the time in the early 90s, and learned from each other and developed LCA learning by doing. And then later it became standardized, etc. So that was environmental LCA. We're also known for the LCA software CIMA Pro, which is being resold all over the world. Also in Sweden, there is a partner as a reseller. And actually, at the moment, he is not there because they have a big reseller meeting in Spain because we are represented in 25 countries. One of the things I've passed over management to what I always say, a much better director than I was. But I have also I'm still working on the field of biodiversity, actually also together with Yannick, and also on social LCA, which we started, we'll explain that, around 9 years ago. And that project is still ongoing, and you'll see some of the results of that during this training.
Yes, and I will be the co-trainer. So Yannick Pillay, I am an analyst at Prey Sustainability. And as Mark said, I work with him quite closely with social impact and biodiversity domains. And yeah, a lot of what we do is training, but also facilitating carrying out these assessments with companies. So yeah.
I will now go off screen and try to solve my computer problem, but I will still be in the room. Don't worry.
Well, I thought we could start with a small introduction from you all as well. So if anyone would like to share, of course, I'd love to know what brings you to this class and why you're interested in this topic, perhaps why you enrolled for the course, or what expectations you have, any curiosities you have. If you are interested in applying social LCA in your research domain, yeah, any responses on that? Yes, David, I see your hand.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was interested in this course because I recently, in my work, started to work in many projects with LCA. I'm mostly working with technical research and experimental research, and so I'm learning LCA, like kind of CIMA Pro, and the social LCA, I've heard about it before, but it's just been always very conceptually abstract to me. And so when I saw this email about the course, I thought, well, this is really perfect because it's 2 days and it's not like 4 months or something. And I really want to get a taste of what it's like, and also just strengthen the whole LCA knowledge that I have, because I'm really just a beginner. So that's really why I'm here.
Great, great. Nice to meet you. Thank you for sharing. Then I see Louise's hand up.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Okay, good. Can you also see me?
Yes.
Okay. So I beg your pardon. I'm in a car at the moment, but I just wanted to say hi. And I work with Dalia at SLU with food waste, and I work a lot with LCA as well, using the CIMA Pro software. And we are trying to, in my project, assess the benefits of reducing food waste in different innovative and novel solutions. And for that, we use primarily the environmental impact, but we are also looking into the benefits from assessing the benefits for biodiversity and also the social benefits, because food is very close to heart, and my colleague Nina is also joining us, and she works even more with the social aspect. So we look forward very much to learn how this could potentially be included into our project to give us better understanding of the total impact and not only on the environmental aspect.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I hope for.
Good to hear. Good to hear it's on the radar. Great. We have Priscilla as well. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Yeah, my name is Priscilla, and I work as a researcher at SLU as well at the Department of Energy and Technology. And I have been working with LCA since my PhD. And the goal was always to have a full LCA, but it was never manageable, sort of, because both environmental and economic is easier to understand and to picture it, and the social has always been the struggle. So I have been proposing to do a social LCA since my PhD, but I haven't managed to really wrap my head around it. So that's what I'm hoping for, that I could get a better view or a better idea of how it works and hopefully apply, because I mean, I have been working with systems of solid waste, wastewater, and now manure and biogas, and everything. You always have people, and you need to take into consideration the social aspect as well. And we have been focusing mainly on the environment. So I would love to actually be able to include the social aspects at some point. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, great to hear. Thanks. And we have Nathaniel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yeah, you're correct. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I don't have any previous experience with the working LCA, but then we are working in developing a product. But then this product has concerns from the consumers. So I just want to broaden my knowledge on how social, like from people have some kind of idea towards a given product, and then I just want to have some idea if there is any way to tackle it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, hopefully we can provide some answers to you. Thank you. We have another hand from Anuron. And also, that's how I'm pronouncing it correctly.
No, you're pronouncing it totally correct. Yeah. So hi everyone. So I work with Nathaniel in the same group. So yeah, I have not worked with LCA before as well, but there's no harm in learning a new technology, if I may say, and I'm sure like it will be helpful for me in the future, because I think currently the research, it's interdisciplinary, and I think it's great to have an insight about a new thing, and I'm sure it will be definitely helpful for me in the future. So I'm here.
Yeah, great to hear. Thanks for sharing. Okay, great. It looks like you're all very excited to jump in. So I think we can actually jump in firstly with this test, and I'm actually quite interested to know if any of you did it or answered some of these questions. So this test is from a book called Factfulness, and it aims to dispel some of the misinformation we often consume in the media. We often have quite a negative view actually on global development issues, when in fact sometimes that's not the case. And quite an interesting fact is that the average monkey will get 6 out of these questions right, and the average human 3.2, which shows that if you actually have a randomized guessing system, that they would actually perform better on this test than a human does. I'm quite interested also in your responses to this test. Is there something that you found shocking perhaps, or some interesting things that you learned, and did you perform as well as you had hoped? If anyone wants to share, you're welcome to do so. Yes, Dalia, I see a hand.
I actually did the test and it was very, very interesting for me. I didn't expect the answers. I would say I had like three or four of them were the right ones. The other one were totally wrong.
Yeah.
And it was unexpected answers, really. I learned so much through it.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
totally recommend that others do it.
Yeah. Good to hear.
Thank you.
And Priscilla, you also have a hand raised.
Yeah, I also took the test, and I actually read the book Factfulness a while ago, and I still got a lot of them wrong. So yeah, it's just it's a nice view on the world, and to see how much we have misconceptions, which most of the time is quite good, that we're actually doing better than we think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I found it extremely interesting, and I'm South African, so I come from a lot of like a very developing country, and even then I feel that I'm not aware of generally global development statistics, which is kind of shameful, I think. But it seems that everyone doesn't do very well. So yeah, that was an interesting start, I think. And there's a few very interesting graphs that we have also from that are resourced in this book. So if we look at some important development metrics like income and lifespan, we can see that the span of various countries are shown here, and the size of each bubble shows the population. And what is considered more developed is a higher lifespan and higher income. So moving from this bottom left to the top right is seen as a country really progressing. So I think this is an interesting view globally of where each country is situated. And it's interesting to see perhaps your own country and why it is in the position that it is. I know I can spot South Africa somewhere in the middle there, middle bottom-ish. And it's kind of explainable. It's one of the strongest economies in Africa, but also has extremely bad healthcare services, large prevalence of diseases, and so the lifespan sits on the lower end, but the income end is growing. So interesting to spot your own country and perhaps try to understand a bit more where it sits in relation to other countries on this map. And good to see just a big graph on global development like this. Then we have other interesting visuals to look at. So if we look at development on a time scale, so the differences between 1965, for example, and 2021, where income has grown largely and has pushed those who live below the poverty line above. So interesting to see that also where you draw the line in a temporal perspective shows where the benchmark is, for example. So you can see that there's major progress in income growth in Asia and large parts of the African continent, but there's still a large population that lives in extreme poverty, so under this $2 per day line. And then I will share just a few more graphics from this book, Factfulness, where this one shows a number of babies born per woman and the child mortality rate. So in more developing countries, we consider that there are smaller families and fewer children die. And over the years, we can see the progress here in countries moving into that developed box where they have access to healthcare, for example, and that women have an appropriate amount of education to make decisions about their own reproductive rights. So here we see also that a large amount of countries are moving into a very progressive status. And lastly, it's important to look at where we're going. So it's forecasted, of course, that there will be a large population growth in the coming 20 years. And this requires many social systems to be strong enough to carry this population. So this is shown here on the left. And on the right here, we see that different necessities, basic necessities like transport and water and food are all defined differently depending on the income level of a population. So we see that level 1, I think, is under $2 a day, level 2 under $8, and level 5 under $32 a day. And here we can see as we move from this low income level to high income level, that so does these basic necessities. So this was just a bit of context. And now we will jump a bit more into focusing on social impact. So what exactly is a driver for engaging with this topic of social impact? So in the past, the way that we measured performance back in the old days of Henry Ford was to measure performance based on productivity and profitability, quality, and safety. And this was really related to getting out a product as quickly as possible with highest quality at the lowest price point. And then we began the discussion on environmental impact. So then we began discussion on understanding performance through the use of resources, through emissions, through carbon footprinting, through use of water, and the impacts of pollution and waste. But we have missed out on social impact. So the question of social impact had not been really addressed. And there were questions about how we do this, how do we measure this? Is it measurable? And we understood that there is a huge cost to getting it wrong. So now we all have a lot of access to information at our fingertips all the time. Consumers are better informed and can obtain real-time information about what happens in the world, especially what happens within supply chains. And then there's the opportunity of getting things right. So companies who are able to show that they have a positive social impact can differentiate themselves. They can be seen as being transparent. And in this world of fast-paced communication and increasing transparency, social impact data can actually help find improvement opportunities and differentiate a product from kind of a normal benchmark, for example. There's also the piece of investors speaking up. So here on the right, you can see the large growth in green bonds or sustainable bonds, and that there's this forecasting of a lot of investment put in these kinds of indices, for example. So there's also money being put behind these kinds of investments or this kind of assessment done on products. And then, of course, we know that there are these kind of scathing articles that have been written where there are certain social impacts that come to light, and it shows that companies are actually not being responsible within their supply chain. So here you can see a few snippets from The Guardian and from other news sources that there are many social impacts along the supply chain that are not accounted for, and companies perhaps don't even know a lot of the time. but a lot of the time do know and are not transparent about it. So really, it feels that we are caught between these three sides. There's a lot of pressure from consumers and NGOs. There's a lot of pressure from investors and also from governments. So from consumers, it's specifically to manage, improve the reputation, and to identify new product market combinations, as well as to abandon product lines that are perhaps no longer acceptable according to social standards. Then on the investor side, investors want to make high impact investments that grow quite fast. They don't want to invest in unsustainable products because they are risky, and these risky supply chains can be disrupted or due to scandals, for example. And there's the risk of legal challenges. So from an investor side, they are really pushing against companies here. And then lastly, from governments, they also want, a company also wants a license to operate, to perhaps align with these global goals like the SDGs, for example, and they want to avoid being regulated. So there's these kind of three arguments. And then the way that we look at the economy is also changing a little bit. So this may look familiar to you. It's a snapshot from the book Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. And she introduced this donut model, which is kind of a new way to look at the economy. So here you can see that in the green region, I don't know if it's very clear, but this is kind of the safe zone where we're able to safeguard environmental factors. And here it's overlaid with some planetary boundaries here from Rockström. And we see that some of these planetary boundary systems have already been reached. So for climate change and biodiversity loss, for example. And not only is it important to use our resources within a reasonable capacity, it's also important to have this social foundation, that these social systems don't fall apart during our operations. So I'll quickly go through a few social metrics that we consider in international law and global policy. And these have kind of shaped the way that we've developed the handbook over the years. So the four that we have really considered and are strong influences over what we develop in our methodology are these four. So the first is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is quite a milestone document. It's extremely familiar to everyone, of course. The 26 articles that were drafted by the UN General Assembly after World War II. And it's generally considered a common standard of achieving the correct kinds of behaviors for all peoples and nations. And it sets out for the first time the fundamental human rights that are universally protected. So it's been translated into, I think, 500 different languages, and it's widely recognized to have inspired and really paved the way for other human rights treaties that have come after it. And it's quite a fundamental document which has been used on a permanent basis throughout different legislative bodies and in different regions of the world. So this is really our principal document. Then the second one is the OECD guidelines on labor standards and economic integration. And these labor standards specifically refer to rules and regulations that govern working conditions. So working conditions composed of working time and employment stability, workers' rights and minimum wage, and health and safety. And these regulations are established through different legislation in collective agreement legislation for both. And it's quite important to also distinguish that labor standards are different from actual working conditions. So actual working conditions include labor standards, but also productive efficiency and other kind of factors, and as well as degree of exposure to international trade. And this document outlines mostly the stakeholder of workers. So it mostly deals with how workers interact with a business or a company. Then the third one we look at is the ILO labor standards. And this is the International Labour Organization, which develops a system of labor standards and promotes opportunities for both women and men to obtain decent productive work. And it takes into consideration these conditions of freedom, equity, security, and dignity. And it's really important to apply standards like this in a globalized context to ensure that we're all looking at the same, we're all using the same benchmark and the same kind of standard. And of course, with an increasingly globalized economy and supply chain, it's really important for standards like this to tell us what is acceptable and not. And then lastly, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were developed in 2015. And these 17 goals were developed as a blueprint for peace and prosperity, with the goal of achieving all of the targets by 2030. There are many different companies that have reported against the SDGs and are tracking their progress towards it as 2030 grows nearer and nearer. And there are these sub-indicators that give an indication of progress towards these goals. So out of these 4 different standards, there are some common characteristics. So amongst these 4, they're all based on international consensus. And these and other treaties are all part of this international legal system. And the consequence of this is that perhaps a lot of these documents are not extremely concrete or detailed. They sound, when reading it, a bit like guidelines and perhaps vague at times. But they're also good descriptors of what is deemed acceptable and not acceptable. So these are the common kind of traits. And almost all countries have actually signed these agreements, which means that there's a more diverse view on these global problems, hopefully less cultural bias from the West. And it should be noted that there's still a lot more strict regulation and implementation of these 4 standards in more developed countries than lesser developed countries. And that's a lot of information. So I will ask, do you have any questions so far? Or is everything very clear?
Yeah, hello, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Yes, yes, thank you for very interesting discussion. I was thinking about the differentiation as you considered, I think, as one of the drivers. Is that differentiation from generating more benefit for the, especially for the companies that producing the product, or from what perspective that can be considered? I mean, if you can comment more, that part is not clear for me.
Yes, this is,
Yeah.
yes, thank you for your question. This is a very difficult question to answer. Of course, for a company, its main value proposition is to make revenue and to make income. But here we're proposing expanding that value system to include impacts on society, on the environment, on other stakeholders, any non-financial related impacts and dependencies, and also to understand that a company depends highly on the resources that it uses and is at risk of potentially losing that. That shouldn't be the only consideration, that there's a risk of a business operation no longer being able to be satisfied. But the concept of sustainability is really expanding that value system to include these other impacts and these other dependencies. So I think this question could go into a very long debate, actually. It's a very difficult concept to understand, but yeah, this is what we aim to do. It's really for a company to be accountable for what it produces and how it pollutes.
So can for example, consider as if a company produces a product that is more socially sustainable product, then the company can get more value as a differentiation value that can lead to, yes, productivity or profitability for the company. Can we understand it like that? Maybe.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And we will shortly also look a bit at impacts and dependencies and the way the capital's approach, which says that actually a company in developing this social and human capital by accounting for their social impact, that they can also generate value for themselves as a business in terms, and maybe not in financial terms, but maybe in trust, in better relationships with clientele, and those kinds of things. So perhaps it's not traditional value creation, but still a form of capital, so a form of value.
Can I maybe add here? Is the sound good? Because I'm a bit far away from the Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So one of our members, DSM, it's a chemical company, now just changed to a food company in the Netherlands. They have been one of the oldest participants, and they call this social and environmental assessment a growth driver. So it's really their way to go forward. So their internal strategy is that we should only innovate things for which there is a societal need. And they are realizing that the products they develop in that way actually they're profit makers. So they see this really as the business case for them is very clear. And they see that simply being proactive and understanding societal needs and taking that into account, these are the most successful products for them. So they are very adamant on that. And some others are starting to say similar things there. But if you're in a more challenged industry like steel making, you also have to protect yourself against all the criticism which is typically happening in mining and in coal, and now at the moment with carbon. So they only make steel, so they cannot say there's a different product for everything. They only make steel. So there it is more the way they manage the supply chain that makes a difference for them. And now they are challenged, of course, that steel has to be carbon neutral. So they have to reinvent all their factories, and they will see also a lot of social issues coming up. So the perspective of each company depends a little bit where you are in the supply chain. And so we have one company, Fuji Oil, the Japanese company, who does a lot of oil like cacao and but also palm oil. And they see also challenges there and also legislation coming up. So sometimes companies are a little bit more in a defensive position, and sometimes they're more in a bit of offensive position, and they all have to deal with it. Does that help?
I'm getting some nod.
Okay, good.
Okay, so at this point, I propose a short break. So a 5-minute break, and perhaps we can come back at 10:47. So let's take a breather.
Sure. Shanik, if you don't mind, can I share the test? The test was very interesting, and maybe our participants would like to try it during this break or the lunch break.
Yes,
Is it okay with you?
yes, please.
Okay. Thank you, and see you.
Thank you.
Let's continue then the short story and on
Great.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've just also added a few extra slides on environmental LCA, just as a good framework to try to understand where our starting point was as well. And I think some of you don't have a lot of experience in LCA or haven't used it or heard of it before. But life cycle assessment, what is it? It's a science-based methodology to evaluate environmental and social impacts related to a product or service from cradle to grave. And the methodology is a standardized method that ensures that it's reliable and transparent. So there are a number of ISO standards that we use and that we abide by to carry out our LCA assessments. And in each of these life cycle stages, from this raw material extraction right until a product is disposed or recycled, there is a number of impacts that can occur. So a product can use a number of resources as well as emit different pollutive effects within each life cycle. So for the environmental life cycle assessment, as I said, there are these standards, these ISO standards that define exactly the procedure of carrying out the assessment. And it starts with this goal and scope phase, which is extremely important to try to define what the product does, how it functions, and what assumptions we make around the product system. In this phase, we also choose the impact assessment method. So how do we choose to, what impact assessment method do we choose? And then define how to communicate this or what the results might mean in the context of the study. And then we will collect data on the product system and calculate emissions and resource use. The next step is to apply this impact assessment method. So for us, we do this in a CIMA Pro context, and there are a number of different impact assessment methods we could apply to a product. And the last step is interpretation. So what this might look like is a framework that's a bit like this. So a goal and scope, inventory analysis, impact assessment, and then this interpretation phase. And important to note here that these arrows are going kind of circular. So it is an iterative process. We learn while doing and feedback information back into each of the steps so that we can really refine the process as much as possible. And there are many issues in LCA as well. So I'm just going to load all of these issues. So to produce a paperclip, for example, I need to make steel. To make steel, I need coke. To make coke, I need mine workers. They need steel tools, and their managers need paperclips. So there's this circular nature of issues that we experience. Another example, in an LCA of pasta, I need to know how long to boil to boil the pasta for. Which fuel do I use, and how much water does my user actually use this to boil? What is the intended use of the product? It's sometimes not something that we actually know. Another example, if I make steel, I produce slag as a byproduct, and the slag is used in cement. How do I allocate these impacts of steelmaking over these two products? And another example, I want to know where the steel of my paper cup comes from, but they buy the steel on the London Metals Exchange. So how can I do a proper impact assessment? So this is a globalized supply chain. If I buy something on a market, a globalized market, how do I know actually where this resource comes from? So these are the many challenges that we experience in environmental LCA. And
is that your younger sister? Or?
Probably. But there are many solutions as well. So we need to also understand where the materials come from. We need to get data beyond just the first tier of our suppliers. We have to define the system boundaries of our product, and we have to choose allocation rules. We also have to make certain assumptions on the user group, so who uses our product after which manufactured it, and where does it go? Where does it end up? In what landfill or incinerator or recycling plant? And if we are comparing products, we also have to choose a basis in which we can compare them. So these are some challenges, and I'm not sure what that animation.
Well, this is about, this is an example of hand drying systems. So how you would look at a cotton roll, for instance, which you use for drying your hands. And here you see an example in the lower left. Cotton produces two things, so you have an allocation problem. You have seeds who are used in cattle feed and fibers, which you use. There's also something about the use phase, how often people pull the cotton. So there's a lot of these issues are in this small, nice example. And we indeed compared it also with electric hand drying, and then you try to see, there you have, again, assumptions, and still you are able to get an impression where the hotspots are. It's not always easy to say which system is the best, because these assumptions are unavoidable, and we'll see that also in social LCA. We have to deal with assumptions. It's not rocket science, as we call it. There's always room to recalculate based on another assumption.
Yes, and other concepts to be introduced to in environmental LCA is foreground data, which comes from primary sources. So for example, if there are well-known documented sources that are specific to your production system, this is considered primary data. But a large part of what we model is also background data from databases. And we will go through some of these social hotspot databases later on. But sometimes this is, we have to use a large majority of our information that comes from these databases, and that's unavoidable. And then lastly, why are social metrics different? So there's a complete different nature of social metrics. So where environmental metrics has a very linear way of organizing data. So for example, if you have 2 kilograms of carbon emissions, this is of course twice as bad as 1 kilogram of carbon emissions. But social LCA is not as linear. So for example, if you have 1 incident of child labor versus 2 incidents of child labor, they are not twice as bad, but both situations are equally as bad. So there is this nature of linearity that doesn't apply here to social LCA. For environmental LCA, of course, the laws of nature give these upper and lower limits and ranges. So this planetary boundary system can be described within environmental LCA as there is this physical boundary of the amount of resources that are possible to be produced. So the example here is to use a certain amount of energy to produce steel. But in the case of social LCA, the process has very little influence on the impacts. So a steel company can have exactly the same social issues as a cotton producing company, for example. Then for the last example of environmental LCA, databases exist with quantitative information that can describe these impacts and these emissions. Whereas for social LCA, some data exists per sector or per producer, but often they are very qualitative, and perhaps qualitative is also a better way to describe social impacts than quantitative data, for example. So here we see really the huge differences between the two domains.
Yeah, so for those people who are used to environmental LCA, they have the disadvantage that they have to sometimes forget what they have learned. And for the people who are new to environmental LCA, they have to grapple with a lot of new concepts. I see Stanley.
Yes, I've got a question. So this probably would apply to type 2, is it? Because perhaps when you think about type 1, you probably need to have it more quantitative, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll get there. So indeed, type 1 and type 2, that's a term introduced by the Social LCA Alliance. We'll show that in the handbook we do it a little bit different, but let's postpone that till we get there, if you don't mind.
Okay.
But this difference is more or less the same, I guess, for type 1 and type 2. Just fundamental that in social, it is not linear. It is not typically linked to the laws of nature, which you have in environmental LCA. If you have a certain steel technology, some companies do that a little bit better and some bit worse. But on average, you know a little bit how much impact you get from steel producing. But in social, we don't have that. So that's quite a fundamental difference. So you cannot say, okay, I have an average of all steel. That is difficult, at least. And then databases, you will see that there is now 30 years of experience of building environmental databases, but there is actually very little experience with developing social databases. And there's even questions whether we'll ever get there because of these fundamental differences. So that's a challenge we'll see. Yeah, Nathaniel?
Yeah, on the linearity part, can we make quality of life as a kind of matrix?
Yeah, quality of life is a kind of our ultimate goal or well-being. Mm-hmm. And child labor or training or other topics are really feeding into that. And also that we'll come back to that. But also quality of life is not linear. It depends on a lot of optimizations. Yeah. Okay, there's eagerness to go on, yes. I think. This was a kind of sidestep because we wanted to cover quickly environmental LCA. Of course, we also organize 3-day courses to explain what environmental LCA is. So it's really rough what we do, but yeah.
Just a brief introduction. We also wanted to mention that we are not alone in the methodology that we develop. And we develop our methodology often in parallel with some of the other initiatives that come up with their own perspectives and their own views. And 2 of these that I've put here are the Social LCA Alliance, which Marcus just mentioned. And they have written the UNEP Social LCA guidelines and just updated the new methodological sheets in 2021. And this describes all impact categories and all stakeholders, and it defines them, as well as data sources and indicators that can provide information towards each social topic. And then the Capitals Coalition, which has a social and human capital protocol, which looks specifically at the theory of how to understand dependency and impact pathways, and defines a bit the guidelines, how to measure different capitals. And we'll come back to this capitals thinking a bit later. But we'll also introduce the product social metrics roundtable. And as Mark has said, this started 9 years ago. And it started really with us questioning how do we measure social impacts, how do we account for it in the supply chain, and what do clients ask for, what do consumers ask for, what do employees ask for, and how can we create a method that reflects this. So it grew from a roundtable with several case study companies and industrial partners to where it is now. And we've included here just the timeline of additional documentation that we have updated the handbook 5 times, I think it is. And we've added several other documents like the methodology handbook, several case studies, and then the social topics report, which describes the social topics are the equivalent of impact categories in social LCA, and describes the definition of each social topic as well as their reference scale and the way they are scored and the performance indicators that go with them. And last year we have transitioned now into a new way of working, into the social value initiative, where we are taking a bit of a different direction and moving a bit away from traditional LCA frameworks into how social value is created. And here we are setting up a community of practice where we really believe that in using the methodology and in receiving feedback and response about how that process goes, we can improve our handbook and we can improve the way social impacts are accounted for. So we continue forward in this direction. And that's just a small introduction, but it's important to also introduce these core concepts of social LCA. And I've already introduced environmental LCA, but we think of social LCA also in this procedural kind of stepwise format, where we have used the life cycle assessment framework to inform how we do a social assessment. And it starts with preparing, so understanding the challenges and the context that our product system is in, looking at material topics and looking at the availability of data, which is a huge component of a study. Then we move on to the goal and scope in a similar way to environmental LCA. Then a hotspot identification, assessing these hotspots, and then the last phase, which is interpretation. So where we have started in our concepts is firstly to look in a similar approach to environmental LCA across a life cycle. So from the supply chain through to use and end of life, what are the stakeholders that we should be addressing? So upstream, we should be addressing small-scale entrepreneurs and workers that work along our production line. During the use phase, it's users, and during end of life, again, small-scale entrepreneurs and workers. And then over all of these life cycle stages, there's of course the local community that, in the specific location that we operate in, this is always a stakeholder that we should consider. Then another important core concept is this reference scale approach. And here, this is a qualitative approach to understanding social impact, where we say that we can score a company based on a 5-point scale that ranges from -2 to +2, where the 0 scale is a generally acceptable level. So here we use industry standards to tell us what a general acceptable level for a specific social topic is.
And the international agreements, especially.
And especially international agreements. And those 4 international agreements that we've covered already, we fill into each social topic where they are mentioned. And here is where we actually score a company's social performance. And it may be acceptable, generally acceptable situation, but if a company performs above and beyond this, they are considered, they get a +1. And if they are the best in class in the social topic, they score +2. And then if the situation is unacceptable, so if there is an incident of someone being paid under living or minimum wage, then they will score a -1. And if the situation has no improvement, then a company will score a -2. So another important core concept is that we have these stakeholder groups that we can affect with a social topic, and a social topic relates to that stakeholder group. So for workers, an important topic is occupational health and safety, but also other labor conditions, including remuneration, work-life balance, and other social topics that relate specifically. And each of these social topics have performance indicators that tell us when we are performing well, and have associated data sources that we can feed into that performance indicator that can tell us if we are scoring above or below that generally acceptable level.
It's important to note that so you collect data on the performance indicators, and these are almost always defined as yes/no questions. So that simplifies your data collection quite a lot, because you have to judge whether certain conditions are met or not. So here are just a few examples. Of course, there are many more. And that is easier than trying to establish, yeah, I think this company has a good occupational health and safety. Then it's quite subjective if you do that. Also there, we are still developing these performance indicators, but at least in the social topics report, we have collected a lot of them, which are quite relevant, we think.
Yes, we have a question from David.
Yes, thank you. Regarding the table with the stakeholders addressed, I mean, all the stakeholders in the table, of course, are people. I was just wondering if we have communities, workers, small-scale entrepreneurs, why not large-scale entrepreneurs? Why not, why is it, why small scale, for example?
Well, we distinguish that, and actually there's a lot of thought went into that lately, and in the new topics report release we try to define that better. But workers, we consider people who have a boss. So if you collect data, you ask the boss, and you look at how the boss manages his people, what kind of rights, worker rights are there. But small-scale farmers, they don't have a boss, or people working in transport, or even in sometimes artisanal mining, they work on their own, so they are their own boss. So that's why we call them small-scale entrepreneurs. And for those, you cannot ask them, do you have a living wage? Because they don't know their wage, because they have irregular data. Farmers often produce their own food, so you have to rethink the question about living wage. So that's why we separate those two.
Okay.
And,
yeah.
Does that help?
Yes, that clarifies. Yes.
And another question, of course, is a logical next one, is that small-scale entrepreneurs, they live in the local community. So also we have put quite some thought in how you distinguish people who are a small farmer, but also part of the local community. So it's not enough time to go into that in any detail, but it's a good question, because we're struggling with it ourselves. Dalia?
Yes, we have a question in the chat from Nat. Could you give us some examples about the questions that you asked for social LCA, please?
Well, there are a few on this screen. So indeed, if the people have productive equipment, so that's a yes, and the occupational health and safety is monitored, then we think that this is a general acceptable situation. Or maybe I forgot, maybe occupational health and monitored is actually also a +1 already. Yeah, I think it's a +1. So if both answers are yes, it's a +1. If they get productive equipment, but there is no monitoring, it is probably a 0. I don't know by heart. We have to look that up in the tables. And forced labor, if there is incidents found, but there is a corrective action plan. So a company says, yes, in my community, I'm sourcing from a company which used to have forced labor, but they have now given me evidence that they are changing that and stopping that, then that would be a -1, because it is forced labor is of course unacceptable, but we said if the company has credible evidence that it is stopping that, then it could be a -1. Does that help? But again, there's a social topics report for every social topic. We have tried to define that and try to develop the performance indicators and also try to explain why we have done that.
Yeah, so like Mark said, I think we only distributed the handbook, but the social topics report actually gives the data requirements to meet each of these levels for each social topic.
Yeah.
And then it's a bit clearer. So we can also send that around if it's.
By the way, it's all publicly available on the internet. So it is a completely transparent and process. We don't own the handbook. The companies own it, but it's a Creative Commons license.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I've got a question. So do you also put like society at large and local communities? How do you handle that?
Yeah, that's a good question. In Social LCA Alliance, they have a special working group on society. And we are indeed currently discussing to what extent we should do that. Indeed, at the moment, social impacts affecting society are usually taken under local communities. So creating jobs, contribution, economic development, we see that also as a local responsibility. But for really, truly global companies, you could also argue that it's not a local issue. So it's an area where we are still thinking at the moment. Also, things which are really detrimental, like corruption, we have it under the economic development thing, but not a specific target. So that's an area where we are still discussing. At the same time, we want to keep the number of topics relatively low, otherwise it becomes unmanageable. So we are also careful not to add too many topics and stakeholders. It's a compromise, which doesn't mean that you should stop thinking by the list we have created. You can also in environmental LCA, sometimes you don't have a real good impact category. So you can also qualitatively describe it. Hey, there is still an issue which is not fitting very well under the topics. There's one case study now on the web from a company who developed a case study on artisanal mining, so gold mining, which is known to be a problematic area. And they were courageous enough to describe that. And they have actually created a number of specific topics for mining, which are both societal and local community oriented. So the system is quite open, basically, how to expand it. Yeah, good questions.
Yeah, this is of course why it's important to understand the approach and the framework that we're proposing, because this is just our thoughts. But if you want to develop a social impact method of your own, there are endless different social topics that you can consider within the context of your study.
We'll come to that also.
Yes. Yeah.
Almost there.
So just a brief gloss over assessing performance. So data is collected on the level of this performance indicator, and they're generally these simple indicators, so yes, no answers. And for each social topic, there's about 8 to 12 performance indicators. And depending on the combination of these answers, the score is determined. So we already glossed over that. And then this is just a short introduction to the social topics for these 4 stakeholder categories. And as we said, it's workers, users, local communities, and small-scale entrepreneurs and their associated topics. And we have 25 here that we consider as part of our handbook. And I will hand over, I think, to Mark to explain a bit more about how these came to be.
Leave the slide on, maybe, because it's in. So there was this question about the difference between workers and small-scale entrepreneurs. For instance, you see 1.2, that remuneration. So that is what you can ask the boss, how much do you pay? But if you go to small-scale entrepreneurs, we say meeting basic needs. Can these people generate the income to have a reasonable income? Basically, enough for your family, enough for sending children to school. But you see also in the local communities, access to material and immaterial resources. Does the company block access or provide access maybe to electricity or to a road? So you, as a company, you don't pay this local community, so you cannot ask them how much you pay them. But you can, of course, see if you have a positive or negative impact on local communities. So that's why we have to, sometimes it's the same theme, but we have to reformulate it to fit with the community. Yeah? Okay, then next, indeed. So we have also thought a bit about so in the environmental impact assessment, we do something like we have a kilogram of CO2. Kilogram of CO2 has impact on the radiative forcing. That can change, that is calculated by CO2 equivalents. That is a kind of measure. And then we have climate change as the impact on the right hand. And for social, we try to think of something similar, and we use some science which is already available. That's called the theory of change. So a company can invest maybe in education or buy better protective gear to protect their workers. Then there can be an activity like the training itself, or explaining, or having a system in place so people actually use the masks and the gloves they are provided. Then the output is, hey, we measure lower number of accidents. The outcome is that people feel more safe, maybe even work more motivated, if it is about protective equipment, or if it's about education, they are applying the knowledge and they are producing better coffee, if it is about coffee farmers. And the impact is then they generate more income, they send the children to better schools, they have better housing, etc. So that's a kind of cause-effect mechanism we have. And our thinking was that measuring impact is really difficult. If you start training now, that will have effect only in about 10 years or so, or if you're optimistic on the impact level. So it's difficult to measure, but we can try to measure on the output level. Are these children really going to school? Or are people indeed using these protective equipment? Or is land grabbing less there, or is something happening to avoid that? That's what we call performance measurement. And so that is our thinking here. And if you go one click further, you see, yeah, one more. In the scale, that's too much. On the lower level, it's about risk. It is not really an impact pathway, but the theory of change is especially used to measure above the compliance level, above the 0 level. So +1 and +2 are really trying to measure outputs. The risk, we also try to do that, but it's a little bit more difficult. And so that's our thinking. What are we actually measuring? And we try to measure output. Sometimes it's activity. We'll see later if you look at the UNEP guidance. It's a little bit unclear, but usually they, in what they call the type 1 measurement, they measure input or activities. For the type 2, they measure impacts. Stanley.
Okay, I've got a question. So the idea is to sort of then have some total where you combine these different topics, or you just present them, each topic for itself? I mean, just as they are without maybe combining or anything.
Yeah, this is definitely without weighting across topics. We haven't solved that.
Okay.
And we are not even planning to solve it basically at the moment. But
Okay.
we are trying to see what do we measure. So we try to measure not only how much a company invests in something, but really, does it have some outputs? Does it work? That's what we try to measure. And not completely what's the impact, because that's too far away and too difficult to measure. That's at least our experience in the last 9 years. Yeah. Okay, next, well, maybe it becomes clearer. So then also, Jannik also mentioned, we use sometimes the thinking of social and human capital. And that is actually an idea that comes from the Capital Coalition. It is an old organization. We have been part of that also in the expert teams. And what they do, they say, well, if you in the middle put your business, if you look, they need financial capital. That's clear. They also need manufactured capital. They need raw materials. They need components. They need chips, computer chips. They need fertilizer. But then they also need knowledge, intellectual capital. And they use humans. So they need human capital, skilled workers, healthy workers, people who have certain competences. Then you need social relationship, and that's called social capital, because in a country where everybody's fighting with each other and nobody collaborates, it's almost impossible to run a company. So you need a social structure, you need welfare, basically. And then, of course, you need natural capital. And with that, you can run your company. These are the raw materials if you take a broad scope assessment. But if you look at the output side, they produce financial capital, they produce manufactured capital, they produce knowledge, intellectual capital, but they also influence human capital. Maybe they harm people in their health, maybe they create even better health. They can also influence social capital and social relationship. Maybe they have a very destructive role on social well-being in a society. Maybe they have a better one. And also they can, and that's not always, but they can damage natural capital, damage the natural environment, but they can also help to restore it. So that is the thinking in the Capitalist Coalition, or this actually comes from the integrated, the International Integrated Reporting Council. It's a similar kind of, a little bit more US focused initiative. But it is really outside the environment, LCA community, this is kind of common way of looking at the world. And it's interesting that in the social LCA alliance, they don't consider this at all. But so that's why we think it's important to look at the thinking, because it's so widely accepted outside the LCA community. Does it make sense? Do you understand? Is it clear? Because that's also how we developed our topics. So you saw this list of 25 topics, and we have set together with the companies that, okay, so a company is dependent on social issues, and also it has impact on the right-hand side. So if you don't have engaged workers, if you don't have diversity, if you don't have healthy workers, there's no skilled workers, you have a problem. And this is only for workers. If you have social, but you also have social impacts, you can influence job satisfaction, you can influence health, you can influence through wages and benefits. So these, we look at social issues which are relevant in both ways. So the company is dependent on it and it has impact on it. Go to the next. So for workers, we said, okay, what is actually the area of protection? What do we want to protect as a company or as a society? And we said well-being is our highest level, relatively abstract endpoint. So that is what we all want to protect. That is something we had to agree on. It's not scientifically proven, but it is a consensus. And also the UNEP guidance takes that well-being. We thought well-being is a bit too vague for workers. So we said, no, we should have satisfied people, but also engaged people. Satisfied people could also be very lazy people. And then only engaged people would be very maybe stressed people. So we would like to have something in between. Quite vague, I admit, but it helped us to understand what we needed. And then we said, okay, we need social capital, but social capital works if we have tools, if we have a society that works, if we have transport systems. Human capital, the same, we need that. And we need financial capital because it's about salaries, it's about income. That's very important here. And let's go to the next one. And then, and this is a bit difficult to read, but it's a table also in the methodology guideline report, which you can also read if you're interested. It's a separate report. So we looked at, okay, what determines occupational health and safety? Well, again, human capital, because we need health. We need lower injuries. We need knowledge of procedures, how to work safely, for instance, good instructions. Physical capital, well, we need these equipments. We need very good machinery, not primitive machinery. We need, if it's an office work, ergonomic furniture. And social capital, we need interactions. We need a working culture. We need companies' policies. So these three things are important. And then we put that under the umbrella of occupational health and safety. And so that's our thinking. And that is how, for workers, we came to those 7 social topics, which we said these are the most important. Child labor, discrimination, forced labor, the ability to, what was it? The work-life balance and the freedom of association and collective bargaining. Yeah, that's also important. It was interesting to hear when we had a US company in this says, well, we don't know whether we agree that collective bargaining is such a good idea. You see that also there we have cultural differences. So maybe we are a bit European here. Yeah, so that's the thinking behind, and we just want to highlight it because in the methodology guideline, we have the methodology report, we have explained that further. For just applying it, you don't need to know all these things. The same with environmental LCA, there are thick reports about how we measure acidification. You don't always need to know that. Now, again, for occupational health and workers, then we thought, okay, how do we define it? Because that's also important. And we looked really at international agreements. So the ILO publication was here, and the last bullet, so there's a lot of ways to develop thoughts about occupational health and safety, the objectives. And you can define it in a legal sense that people must have the right to wear protective equipment. They have the right to have the best machinery. But even if you provide all that protective equipment, it doesn't mean people use it. So the ILO and the World Health Organization wrote a definition more on working culture. So it is that even if all the rules are there and you have all the things in a cupboard to protect people from dangerous situation, doesn't mean it's applied. So you need a working culture that actively promotes it. Again, quite vague, but it works, and it works also in the international level. It actually came about when after Chernobyl accident, because in Chernobyl on paper, everything was brilliantly organized. But the working culture was terrible because hardly anyone had read the rules and applied and they all had created their own rules of working with it. And that was an important reason why that reactor exploded, because they simply ignored all the rules. So there's a difference between the paper reality and what is actually happening. Again, vague if you are used to natural science thinking, but this is the issue with social LCA. For all of these 25 topics, we went through that process. What are the international agreements? How can we interpret those? And how can we make a definition? Yeah, next. So again, health and safety. Now we have a detailed version of this 5-point scale. And for instance, at level 0, we said the working conditions and working culture are adequately protecting workers, health and safety, etc., which include, etc., etc. You can read that also in this topics report. On the -2, we see there's a neglect on working culture and working conditions. And -1, we say there is a neglect, but we see that there is some credible evidence that accident rates are going down, that the company has a policy to work on that. And on the +2, you see the company is really kind of generally recognized to be best in class. And it's actually not so easy but sometimes there are even competitions, there are rewards for companies. So the +2 is actually difficult to attain and difficult to get credible evidence on. And that is important, how the scales work. And you'll be working with that if you follow the handbook. If you follow, and we'll come back to that, if you follow the UNEP guidance, you see something similar, but they haven't really defined the scale. So it is really up to you to set the 0 level, the -1 and the -2. So they give guidance. But if I've seen some case study, if you do the case study in Peru, you may also ignore the international agreements. You may also look at what is current the situation in Peru in mining. And so they have a much more flexible, but also with that a less comparable method. So if it depends on the author, what kind of rules you set to yourself. So that's an important difference. And it has both have their merits, but we thought we want to have something which is really based on international agreement, and the reports should be comparable between 2 reports, which still is difficult, but at least we have done our best to do that. Yeah, maybe questions on that, or? Okay. Well, I will browse through this quickly. We have done similar for users. So user well-being, what does it depend? Like things like, of course, health and safety, responsible communication, accessibility. So that's especially for people with a disability. Affordability, that's especially for people who are, well, poor or have other limitations. Privacy is sometimes important. A lot of products don't have a privacy issues, but if there's electronics in it, it becomes important. And effectiveness of comfort, where we say, okay, if a company helps to solve a societal issue, then you can score this. We actually also say it is not about having the most comfortable product. So a Porsche or a Mercedes is not necessarily better than a simple smart car, a low-cost car, because that is not a societal problem. That's nice for the driver if he can afford a Mercedes. But we said, if it solves a real societal issue, if it is a better tool for a farmer, or it's a better tool for a worker, then you can claim this. Difficult to put a hard line, but it is where we, and still an issue of discussion. Yeah. Local communities, similar thinking, health and safety, access to tangible resources, like things like you see things like land, water, forest, knowledge. Does the company help to provide knowledge? Does the company not block access to land and water? Does it maybe help to create roads which it makes for itself, but it allows other people to benefit from it. And maybe it brings electricity, maybe it brings internet. So these kind of things are there. Community engagement. Also, how do you deal with your community? Are you ignoring them or informing them or even taking their opinions serious? Skill development, contribution to economic development. So that is, as you had a question whether that should be societal. We for now say a company usually doesn't have a huge impact on the overall society, but at least they have something in the local community. That's at least the current thinking. Yeah. Small scale entrepreneur, the same, meeting basic needs. So a bit comparable to income, but it is more like the things that you need to be a good small scale entrepreneur or small farmer. Access to inputs and services, women's empowerment. So we don't call it discrimination because the farmer will probably not discriminate to people from another, let's say, race. But women empowerment is really important here. Child labor, land rights, and trading relationships, like fair trading. Is your negotiation position reasonable? These things are, we thought, important for the livelihood of a small-scale entrepreneur. Yeah. Okay. A lot of information.
I guess we have a break coming up in a bit.
Yeah.
So perhaps we can go over maybe 5 or 10 more minutes.
Yeah.
This is just a bit of a summary of a comparison with some initiatives that we've mentioned so far. And we've already been introduced to the reference scale approach in the handbook, but the UNEP guidelines through the Social LCA Alliance also has a similar way of looking at this. There's a slight difference though, because they have this slightly below compliance level and starkly below compliance level, where we have both situations are unacceptable, but there is evidence of improving. And then they have here beyond compliance and ideal performance, which is also quite vague, but also a guideline. And then we mentioned and introduced the 25 social topics that we have in our handbook, but within the UNEP guidelines, they really expand this. So they add the stakeholder category of society and children. And here they add a number of different social topics that can relate to each of those stakeholders. And of course, this expansion makes it a bit difficult to work with when you're actually doing a study. So that is a bit of a difficulty, and that also some of these topics overlap a little bit. So here you see, I think the example of small holders, including farmers, is actually a social topic under workers, but not considered under value chain actors, for example. So again, these are very much guidelines. And of course, the aim here is to be as comprehensive as possible, where our aim is to be usable and to be able to implement our method in a company setting. So yeah, we do consider these topics and try to update our methodology in parallel with some of the concepts that are introduced here. Yeah, I have a question slide, but I don't know if anyone has any questions so far. Yes, I don't know which one was first.
Dalia is on top on my
yes.
screen.
Thank you. Well, thank you for this nice presentation. Really, it's very informative. I'm thinking about the implementation. If I'm going to make a study and I want to implement it, then I need the data collection is mainly from the stakeholders through questionnaires, right? And usually we have the problem of data collection, how I'm going to ensure the engagement of the stakeholders for this.
Yeah.
So can you advise on this point? Thank you.
Yeah, we'll come to that, and that is really a very important challenge. If you send a questionnaire and you ask a company how much CO2 do you produce, you probably get an answer, or not, but there's a fair chance you get an answer. If you ask them how many forced workers are there, you won't get an answer because it's illegal and you can end up in jail if that becomes public. So that's a real big challenge. And indeed, questionnaires we tried in the beginning. In the beginning, we also had a quantitative version of the methodology, and it was really almost impossible. So what we'll explain a bit later is different ways of still understanding what goes on in a company, even if they don't want to say it. If the company is doing great things, then of course they're happy to answer the questionnaire. But especially when you want to understand the risks in the supply chain, it is not really working. So there are already tools. So the hotspot database is one which gives you a kind of suspicion that something could go wrong. There are actually also commercial providers who keep track of about 200,000 companies or so, and they look at what are internet sources saying about the company. That doesn't need to be true, but at least it gives you a little bit more precise information what's going on. So this is really also a big difference in the environmental LCA, that the question you ask it can be harmful for the one who answers the question, while in environmental you don't have that so often. Yeah, Stanley was next, I think.
Yeah, thank you for the nice presentation, but I've got a question to you, Mark. If you have a company, let's say in the Netherlands, which has got good animal welfare, let's say it's a farm, or maybe it's an agricultural company that is producing maybe chicken, I suppose. And then you have got one farm that has got very good animal welfare in the Netherlands. And then in the US, you have this farm that doesn't really care about animal welfare at all. So will they get like the same score or the same performance rating at the end of the assessment if everything else is equally the same?
No, we will definitely advise you to report that separately. So indeed, in general, it depends a lot where things are happening, what kind of legal contexts are there. But you should, there can be huge differences between two similar companies, even in the Netherlands. It could be that that farm is doing great things and his neighbor is even doing very terrible things. So definitely we not advise to merge that, but to report that separately, or to report it as the worst case and the best case. It depends a little bit on the question you want to answer.
Okay.
Yeah. And also don't assume that things in the Netherlands are going fine, especially in farming. There's a lot of human rights abuses in the greenhouses, and because there's a lot of illegal workers. Also in the US, we found in some case studies that it is not always only a problem in developing countries. It's definitely also happening here.
Okay.
Yeah. Tegan?
Yes. Just a similar question, but I want you reflect more on there is some part where you define the skill level of occupational health or something like that, where you compare the company with its peers or something. Can you show that slide? I don't know if that is possible.
Yeah, can you go and do that slide?
Yes, this one.
Slide?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. The company is best in class compared to its peers. Yeah, this seems difficult. For example, if we take two companies or some startup company, let us say, or a new company, it can be, it may be difficult to compare if there is no reference company, or if there is no company in that area or field or that kind of product production. For example, perform very less. So it would be very difficult to compare or for which one to give a comparatively a good that may be not I mean good way to evaluate the health condition if all are not performing good, for example. Yeah, I think you understand.
No, but indeed, if they all perform bad, then being best in class is not very good. I agree with that. I think that's what you want to say. And that we already said we are a bit struggling with this +2. It is actually quite difficult to find the best in class. Although there are, I mean, in environment, we have this concept of best available technology. So there are reports saying that this technology is the best. You can sometimes find in some NGOs who actually say, well, if everybody would work like this in this company, then the world would be better. So they consider a certain example best in class. Or you see sometimes even in the Guardian or the BBC documentary of a company that's really doing great. So you would carefully say, well, maybe that is a best in class company. But we generally recommend everybody to be very careful with this +2 because it is difficult to substantiate. +1 is more, okay, that's more reasonable. The company has a management.
Yes, my point is not about the +2 or 1, 2, 3. The question is, for example, if we have the water quality standard, there is, from a health point of view, sometimes it's possible to set a standard from safety point of view. That can be used as a measuring or as a reference. But when you compare peers, the available companies that are all of them may be poor. So why you compare the companies as for measurement? That is my point.
No, I agree. So the word peers can be a bit misleading here. I agree. It's a good comment. We'll have to maybe think about that.
I think the intention, at least for the +2 scale here, is to look at peers as in other industry. So those who fall within your industry. So it's to avoid situations where we compare, for example, a mine worker or a mining company where a mine worker occupational health and safety is completely different to an office worker, for example, for a software development company. You cannot even compare the two for occupational health and safety. So we need to look at other mining companies and what the occupational health and safety performance there is in the industry. And there is a standard for that. So when we compare amongst peers, here we're really looking at other, those that are within our industry.
There's actually a nice example on the website from this gold mining. They looked at gold mining, and gold mining really has a terrible reputation. But this company had been working with one specific mine in Peru, and they sent an independent consultant to check how the situation. And so they did a lot of data collection. There they give sometimes a +2 because, and I thought it was quite convincing. They had different canteens giving people different food even sometimes, because in some of the work conditions, it was almost unavoidable to expose them to small amounts of a certain chemical. So they took even into account that, okay, this is unavoidable. They had really good equipment, but still we have some heavy metals. And so the people who were exposed to that were in a different canteen and got food, which was actually helping to mitigate the effect of that. Well, I'm still not sure if that is acceptable, because you should at least not expose anyone. But we thought, given the circumstances, maybe you could dare say it is best. It's quite unique what they were doing compared to all their peers in Peru, even. So, but yeah, I warned in the beginning, this is not really rocket science. It's not kilograms of CO2. It's kind of interpretation against a reference. What is acceptable?
Yes, it is good, but good to think also. We have some example from developing country, for example, remote areas where mining operations has very, very disastrous impact on local communities.
Yeah.
And if one of the companies may have relatively less impact, then that is going to get higher result. But actually that one by itself is doing bad from health point of view. So the standard from health point of view should come from the scientific, this health, from health point of view, that should be combined into this rather than comparing the peers. I have that is my own comment.
But in that case, then they would not even qualify for a 0. They would, so our guidance is start at -2. If you see this applies, it's clear. You don't go further even. If you say, okay, it's a bit better than -2, you can go to check -1. If you think that is even a bit better than -1, you go to 0. So before you are at +2, you have gone through the lower levels.
Okay, that may work. Now I understand more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh no, that's important. I forgot to
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So this term best in class actually applies to the best in class of that industry. So you actually have to start at -2.
But if they're all bad, they will not be 0.
No.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I got it now. Thank you.
Yeah. Now important. Priscilla.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it was a more practical question. I don't know if it was mentioned, but are we going to have access to the slides?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll try to send them in the break even. Then you can already see what you just passed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tegana.
No, I think it's not.
Oh.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
It's his. I think his
Yeah.
hand still raised.
Okay.
Yeah, how do you manage like to compare these companies in the same class? Because it feels like there is a kind of publication issue, right? So if you are going to compare one company to other company, and then if you are going to say this company is better than that one, so the other one, so they might think that they're publicly, like their image in public is not so good. So how do you manage to get them on board?
So,
Like
well, again, be very careful with the +2, but we have said that if NGOs and credible NGOs, actually we try to define also that because not all NGOs are maybe credible, but if credible NGOs write a really positive report about a company, then they could be a +2, for instance. That's an example of a performance indicator. Or if they get really well-recognized awards. So also be careful with awards because companies often make their own real awards and then they of course win their own award. But so we said in that case, so if you are really above 0 and even at +1, you may even go to +2 if such evidence exists. But again, it is really, this is the only place where we say compare to peers, but for the rest we try to be more descriptive.
Yeah, and it's often the case in best-in-class situations where if a company is best in class for campaigning for no child labor in their supply chain. So for example, Tony's Chocolonies in the Netherlands is an advocate for slave-free chocolate along the supply chain. They have a very transparent report on a social impact. And it's often these best-in-class situations where there is very good documentation and because they want to market that they are the best in class, of course. And then we consider that this is really something that we should compare our company to, for example. I see there's also a question from Dalia.
It's actually, we have a comment in the chat from Nat. It's about if you could forward us one case study, it will be very helpful to understand. That's it. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, we will do so. We'll do so with the slides.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we are 1 minute overdue, so we can break for a bit and carry on with an activity that we planned in the next session.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll send indeed the slides and I guess also the link to the topics report because that's important. There you see all those scales and all the performance indicators. Yeah.
Okay, and then we will reconvene at 1 p.m.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1 p.m.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, good. Thank you.
See you at 1.
And thanks for all the good questions so
Yes.
far.
Okay, I hope everyone is back. It seems like we have a few faces back already. So as I just said, I thought it would be interesting to continue the discussion. There were so many interesting questions about the hotspot identification and different industries and more questioning about best in class and more conceptual questions. So we thought it would be interesting to actually look into different examples and visualizations. We have a few that we sent around in the break. So we sent access to the website where we have documentation of all of these different reports that we've written over the years, and then some case study reports. And then there's also this community of practice website where we encourage you all to join and to share your own challenges and stories of social LCA, and if it's something that you use in your own research. We always enjoy sharing ideas and exchanging thoughts about the method. For now, we'll go through a few quick examples, and then we'll hopefully get to an activity where we can put some of these concepts to the test. And often with social LCA, the thought of visualizing these results and interacting with this information is quite overwhelming. And especially with a qualitative assessment like this, it's quite difficult to incorporate all of these aspects. So social topics, stakeholder groups, different scoring levels, different life cycle stages. And there's a number of suggestions that we make and examples that we have in the handbook that we're just going to share with you. So one of them looks like this. This is quite a high level of detail. So here it shows 2 different scenarios using different life cycle over different production steps in a process with different social topics and their stakeholder groups. And a visualization like this makes it quite obvious where the hotspots in a supply chain can be seen. So for these 2 scenarios, for example, you can see that under occupational health and safety and remuneration, there are these 2 -2 scores. And so this is a clear hotspot there where there is not an acceptable situation. And this is specifically for the workers stakeholder group for this part of the production process. So visualizations like this can really help us to engage and understand different choices that we make with regards to different suppliers or different materials or components within the supply chain, how that actually influences the social impact. So this makes it kind of easy to understand, at least on a strategic level. And we also have many other different kinds of visualization. So perhaps, Mark, you can explain this one, because I think
yeah, this is a case study, which is actually also a summary is published also on this community website. This comes from DSM, and they one of their new products is that they make new nylon polyamide from fishing nets. So they pay fishermen and fisherwomen to collect those nets, and we have all heard about the plastic soup, but very few people know that actually about half of all the plastic floating in the oceans is old fishing nets, and they're all made of the same material. So also thinking from the standpoint of sustainability, as I said earlier, this company prouds itself that its policy is now based on looking at the societal problem and then develop a solution. And they are chemical companies, so they then said, well, our plastics department can do something with that. The slide is a bit difficult to read maybe, but here they have made a big wheel. So everybody's still inventing a little bit how to present things. And the dark blue part is the local communities. And they look then at the different steps in the production, like washing, extrusion, and then they see where are low risk and medium risk. Actually, they use the colors a bit different than we do in this presentation. And the lower left hand, you see their procedure, how they look at how they collect data and how they interpret data. We'll come back to that. I think that's a bit too difficult to read also.
So this is also just an example of this donut visualization that I hope that you can read it a little bit, but in the middle there's the stakeholder group, and on the outsides are all the social topics, and the colors indicate the different scorings. And in this donut model, you can position it at different parts of the supply chain, which is shown in that bottom image. And this is also a way to try to understand a little bit more where we can see hotspots for which stakeholder groups and where in the supply chain. So this is also a suggestion that we have as part of the handbook.
Yeah, maybe it's good to highlight why we do it this way, or this is one of the ways, is that because it's qualitative, it's very difficult to aggregate parts of the supply chain to make a score representative for the whole product. And because you cannot say a -2 score is half as good as a -1, or half is twice as bad as a -1 score. So we don't think you should aggregate that. In the UNEP guidance, they say that under certain conditions it is possible to do it, but we don't follow that recommendation because we think it is a bit too uncertain to do that. A -2 could be really a big problem, and a -1 could be much less of a problem. So it's an area where we are still struggling, and we are looking at various ways to look at it, maybe to even add a monetary value to the scoring. But so far, we have done an experiment with another university, but so far it didn't really result in something directly usable. So that's still ongoing research, I must say.
Yeah. And I'll just continue.
I thought maybe shall we do the cases first?
Yes, I'm getting there. So I will just explain, just to quickly summarize what we're looking at, and then we'll get to the cases. So just a summary of where we've come from. We've used the life cycle assessment framework, and we've kind of massaged it in our own way to apply to the social assessment. And now we really want to look at how to carry out the assessment. And it first starts with understanding the challenge, of course, and the context. And it therefore first starts with understanding what matters most. So what is material to the study that you're doing and to the product that you're looking at. So we start firstly with this materiality assessment part of the study. And here materiality really helps to select what topics are important. And this, of course, depends on the context of the study, on the product that you have chosen. But in general, we say that the most relevant topics and the most material topics are those that are of interest to the audience that you are firstly engaging with, and also that impact society and business at large. So you have to kind of use your intuitive judgment here to which topics are actually important to your value chain. And here we really want everyone to engage a bit with this kind of exercise. So we want to have a breakout session where subgroups actually think and talk about creating a small map of the supply chain and trying to understand where in the supply chain could they find hotspots, but most importantly, yeah, what topics are material if we are
Let's first focus on that one.
Yes.
So, yeah. So I'm not sure if are you working on a case study already, or you have a case study in mind? Otherwise, we thought we just take a default one, and you're mostly in agriculture. Over the lunch, we had a little bit of chocolate, and we said maybe chocolate is a good case. If you look at the supply chain of chocolate, or the whole production of chocolate, which of these social topics would be your biggest concern? I mean, it is always easy to say, well, everything is important and we want to do all, but that creates a lot of work for you. So it is much better to focus on the ones which we call really material. And maybe I should quickly introduce this graph on the left hand. So in sustainability reporting, we call materiality when something either has a big impact, so impact on the business or on the community, so that's on the horizontal axis, or your audience, your stakeholders want to know about it. So sometimes the stakeholders want to know about something like child labor, that's always, at least in the West, on everybody's mind. But you know that probably there's a low probability that there is a real impact there. But then you still do it. You keep it in. So that's the green ball button, the ball on the dot on the left-hand side. But you can also have impacts where stakeholders have never thought about you, but you know, actually there could be a real issue there, and the stakeholders fortunately don't know it. So that is on the lower right-hand side bullet. And then there are the white dots, which are neither of interest, neither very impactful. So you could think of materiality as either you know that there could be real issues like forced labor or land rights or women's rights or discrimination, or you know, hey, my stakeholders want to know it. And of course, the ones which are on the upper right-hand side of that graph, those are interested for both. So these usually need priority. One thing, if you are from in this more academic setting, it's all quite new. Most companies already have that. So they have already thought about when they do GRI reporting, they have already thought about, okay, what do my stakeholders want to know? Sometimes they've actually really questioned them. And also, what do we know from all kinds of feedback and what the NGOs are telling us, what are probably really important issues. But these are usually not the same as what we have here. So it is also kind of redefining, reinterpreting what they already have. Yeah, is that somewhat clear how that graph works? Because I think it's important too. It's a great time saver if you do that right. By the way, it's also in the first version you make is far from perfect. When you start data collection, you might find that some things which you thought are important don't turn up to be important, and suddenly you discover other things. So it is also an iterative process. So during the process, you can adjust your materiality assessment. But our proposal would be try to make a kind of top 5 or top 6 of the things that really come to mind when you think about either your own your own case study, or let's take African chocolate, maybe like even be more specific, one country, you may choose that. Stanley.
Yes, but I've got a question when it comes to users. Like, for instance, if we are looking at chocolate, maybe let's say they are using some other products that have been sort of manufactured from another supply chain. So in a way, they are also users. Do you see what I mean? So when we say users, do we just look at users of chocolate, or?
Now let's maybe for this short exercise, let's not, well, maybe users are a difficult case indeed. That's true. It's also having sugar, and it also have packaging materials, and it also has a factory. So to keep it simple, maybe just the raw coffee beans is a nice simplification. But indeed, you're right. A lot of products are very complex and contain many ingredients, and then your supply chain becomes much more complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, is this somehow doable, you think? We'll also walk around in the case so we can visit you and try to see if there are issues which need clarification. Yeah, and really there are no wrong or stupid answers. Just try to see if you can grapple with the question. There are no, you don't get marks for it.
Yeah, and maybe we could, I think there's 8 participants, so we could just be in 2 different groups.
Okay.
Yeah, or you want more?
No,
Dalia?
it's great. No, I think this is great. We are 8, 2 different groups will be interesting. And we already have this slide, right? You already sent us the slides.
Yeah.
So each group
yeah.
can share the slide from your PDF.
Yeah.
And it seems like a very interesting topic. Nice example. I mean, most of us love chocolate. I don't know anyone that doesn't love chocolate. So
yeah,
it's a delicious one.
Yes. So we'll do that now. I automatically put you in groups.
Perfect.
And we are, oh, I see co-hosts are in when assigning. So we'll be there. I'll do that out. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you are also in a group. Okay, thank you for coming back. Well, you always have this 60-second clock. Okay, it's nice to have both discussions to hear going in and out. Your discussions are somewhat similar, but also different. I saw that group 2 even made a presentation, a slide. Maybe we should first start with group 1, and I should just say, well, where your discussion went. And as I said there, it's maybe not really important to have exactly 5 points, but also the issues you encountered, the learnings you had from that. Who can say something from group 1, which is the group, I think, of Priscilla and who was else in that?
I think I can say, well, yeah, we discussed a lot about if we should have from each of the category of the stakeholder categories and such. But then we defined a little bit our case in a like small village in a poor area of an African country. So that's how we defined the systems. And then we had occupational health and safety and child labor for the workers, and then contribution to economic development for the local communities, and then child labor again, and fair trading relationships for small-scale entrepreneurs. So we left the users out on this top 5, but not meaning that they're not important or not going to be considered. But since our case is a poor area, this is what we prioritized.
Yep. Great.
Yeah, I think the discussion was really good because you also narrowed it down. So an important part of the process is also to define the scope and the objective, and you narrowed it down to we're only going to focus on the rural parts of the supply chain where this cocoa beans are grown instead of the industrial scale, for example. So this is also a large part of defining the process is scoping it out and what do we include, what do we not include. So that was a good discussion point that I heard in this group as well.
Yeah. Anyone want to add to what Priscilla just said about the drone group? Then group 2. Oh.
I think Tihani.
Yeah. Yes. We have been discussing in relation to this the whole supply chain. Of course, it depends on question you put for the discussion in this session. Otherwise, when we see the whole supply chain, the users, when we say the users, also it depends on how to define, but if you consider as end users, especially in the case of food supply chain, always it is very sensitive, especially as an international trading part. If the food is, from healthy, safety, and the health quality point of view, that may have also sometimes the top priority. So yeah, maybe. But our discussion was mainly we focused on the case of production and the source as African small village. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're right. The user is actually almost a completely different type of data you use there. You don't try to understand what everybody's doing in this chain, but you try to look at the product. What does it do to the user? And the user is even a bit more complicated. So sometimes you have a primary user and a secondary user. So the example we use in the manual is the bus. You make a public transport bus. I suppose you're a company that makes public transport buses. The primary user is, of course, the passenger. But actually, the driver is also influenced by the way the bus is made. So in environmental life cycle assessment, you just have one use phase. But in the social, you have actually different types of users, all affected by the product. So indeed, you need to do a little bit of rethinking, and we try to give some guidance in the report. I don't think we have much slides on that, honestly. No, we can try to see if we still have a bit time at the end to do that. And otherwise, it's fine to ask us some questions also afterwards if you're struggling by mail. Okay, the other group, you had a slide. Maybe it's nice to present that.
Yes, I can share the slide.
Yes, Stanley, please.
Do you all see the?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe someone can present.
Yeah, I can start it. So Stanley actually suggested we first sketch the supply chain, which you see here. So we picked this Ghana as the source of the cocoa, and then some kind of processing hubs in Europe, which this one is in Switzerland, and the company is this Swiss chocolate supplier, and then we have the users. That's what we did, and then we looked at, well, in the example slide, we tried to think what topics in each geographical location, which topics might be maybe the most important, and then finally the chocolates for the users and the Swiss production. And so we came up with these seven topics.
Yeah. Great. And did you, for users, for instance, look at the risk that the consumer wants to know about it, or do you consider health and safety as a real issue? How did you do something with these two axes also, or maybe on the other things? Or was it just that it's an interesting area to look at?
Yeah, so with regards to user health and safety, it's like when you eat lots of chocolate, there are also some side effects to that. If you look at smoking, normally like on these cigarette packets, they put some scary faces and things like that to show that if you maybe do this, you risk getting that. But then with chocolate, actually, I've never seen any like warning label to say if you eat too much chocolate, maybe this might happen to you or anything. I mean, so if you have maybe kids who are under 12 eating so much chocolate, maybe it might be bad for their teeth. So such kind of things, maybe,
Yeah,
they need to be explored. I'm not saying that is what is happening, but you never know. I mean,
if you good point. Actually, we have another topic called responsible communication. That's indeed about, do you communicate well the effects of the products? If you sell alcohol, you have the same. It is not illegal, it's not forbidden, but actually there are some issues. So do you have a responsible drinking policy or something like that? Or do you warn about these things? So that is in one of the other topics, I think 2.2 or something.
Yeah, and of course, if you link the effect, so what you're talking about is perhaps an obesity effect or a global health effect of some sort, cholesterol, heart disease, something like that. If you look at the global burden of disease by the World Health Organization and can link your product to causing one of those health outcomes, then of course this topic is extremely important. So for alcohol and for tobacco and for these kinds of products, definitely health and safety is of concern.
Any other questions or comments to this group or from this group? Great. Well, I hope the purpose was that you really start to get the right questions, maybe not the right answers yet, but that for your next steps, if you start to do the social LCA, that you start to really, okay, these are the kind of questions. So indeed, we must draw the life cycle. That was a good idea. And try to link that to the stakeholders, try to reason why something might be important, which you of course need to verify always. If you say it's important, then you ask yourself, can we collect the data for that? Where would we find that? And that's also an area where we want to go into, where the data is and how to get it. So I hope that this worked for you.
Yeah, I hope it also shows the complexity of an assessment like this, that oftentimes, even within a business context, I don't even know where my raw materials are coming from or exactly where something is produced. And this is an investigation that the company has to actually go through in doing this or in applying this assessment method.
Good.
Okay, I will share my screen again if there are no further comments.
I was going to do this one.
Yeah. Okay, so we move over to the data collection phase, which is a good natural next step because, of course, within our material topics, we now have to figure out where we get data from. And this is still part of step number 1. After we've determined materiality, we prepare a data collection step or strategy. And then I will hand over, I think, to Mark, who will explain a little bit more.
Yeah. So this is the very most practical way of collecting data, which is on the slide. We have already done some work for you. For every social topic we defined, we made a short table of the most important public data sources. And later we talk about the social hospital database. In fact, they very much rely on the same database data sources. These are all, most of them are publicly available for free, not all. Wage indicator is, some data is for free, and global living wage is also not completely for free, but you have ILO, which is always for free. And the World Policy Center is an interesting one because there you can check what the laws are, if any, in a certain country. So we were talking about Ghana for chocolate. You can see that once by accident looked at it, and there's actually relatively little organized regarding health and safety standards for workers there. So you can also check that. So that's anyway, useful research to keep in mind, and we have all those links. For every topics, there are some usually a bit different, but you can find a lot here. Yeah, that's an easy one for your, especially for your orientation. Next. Yeah. Then there are a number of, and this is a bit frustrating if you're coming from the academic world, because they are not for free and they're actually sometimes quite expensive. There are commercial organizations which which provide a lot of data for other industries, and some of the members in our roundtable, they have access to that, and one of them is TEDx Meta. If you would work for a company, you could of course try to see if they can get access to it, but they have a huge number, so about 100,000 companies in their database, and they know what is known about their data. So they have a questionnaire which is sent annually. They also sometimes review it, send people to check whether it's true. And this is a way, they say, to also fight the questionnaire fatigue. A lot of companies get a big questionnaire every day, so they are very tired, and they complain that the time they spent on the questionnaires they could have used to improve the working conditions. That is the good thing about these kind of tools. So they have a lot of data in that. Next. And that's primary data. That's really data from a company. You can also look at other things. So the Fair Trade Organization, they have, there are actually many fair certifications, but this one is, for instance, a nice one because they control each other, the organizations in the fair trade. So if you see a fair trade logo, you more or less can assume that things are not too bad regarding income and working conditions. Also, ISEAL is an organization of organizations, so there are more or less credible labels under ISEAL.org. You can find them. They actually, to become member of ISEAL, you must fulfill quite stringent criteria. Of course, you must also be careful. There are many labels which are not credible because they are just for commercial purposes. I once saw a website with over 300 different labels, which are really funny labels sometimes when you look at what's behind it. So in the topics report, the social topic report, we often refer to them, at least that it gives you the idea that it's level 0. That helps if the company has such a label. Next. Then Data Maran. It's a bit funny, they use artificial intelligence to actually automatically verify all kinds of sustainability reports. It's an interesting one. We were not completely impressed how reliable that is, because they basically count how often the world discrimination appears in their sustainability reports, but they can't really see whether it means that discrimination is something that has a lot of management attention, or that there are many issues, whether it's positive or negative. Still, companies use that, and they have partially some data publicly available. Next. And this is also to show that there is much more than the social hotspot database. Maplecroft is another one that is also a commercial data. They have some data available. You have an example here where they distinguish between extreme risk and lower risk. Basically, many of these tools only tell you about the negative issues, so the -1 and the -2, or at best 0 issues, not the positive issues. There seems to be little interest in the positive issues. They do have some similarities with what is also mentioned in the social hotspot database, which we're going to talk about. They also have indications per country. So they have it per sector, per country, and not per company. So they have specific products like avocado from different countries or magnesium from different countries. That's the kind of data you would find there. Next. Rep risk is one I found really interesting. personally, we have had a very brief time. We had a license for that, but it's also quite costly. What RepRisk does, they listen to, about 60,000 internet sources every day, and they collect that data and they follow about 250,000 companies. And originally it was made for banks, so that banks know what they're investing in, but now it's used quite broadly. And what they calculate is 3 levels: really low risk, high risk, or very serious risk. And from that, they create a risk profile. That's the small graph you see, that there is issues around environment. So BASF is an example here. There are social issues and there are governance issues. But you don't have to trust them. You can read all these issues. You can see who says what. They also distinguish the reliability of the resource. So if it is an NGO nobody had ever heard of, or a newspaper with unclear quality, then it's a low credibility. But if it's, for instance, The Guardian or New York Times, you usually see it, or Amnesty International, they see that as a much more relevant source. So quite a number of our member companies have started to use this because it gives you real data of a real company and not even very old data. It's actually yesterday's data. Of course, you must always interpret yourself, because whatever an NGO says, it could also be that the NGO has an interest to make a fuss about a company. At the same time, companies are very good at hiding things. So it is your responsibility how you interpret it, but it is really transparent, and you can make your own judgment what you think of this message, which is now in the green boxes. Yeah. Okay, next. So in the handbook, we have also tried to qualify those sources. These are the primary data sources that come direct from a company, and how they collect their data. Well, across is not a direct, it's not always clear exactly who gets across, but SEDAX has audits, for instance, and certification schemes have audits, for instance. So that is one way of looking at it. Again, chapter 3 of the handbook gives you that background. Next. We also looked at secondary data sources, and here you'll see the social hotspot database coming up and PTILCA. Those are 2 LCA databases, and we're going to talk about that. Both are available in CIMA-Pro and also in OpenLCA, the 2 LCA softwares. And then with RepRisk, we just discussed, the Datamaron and Maplecroft we discussed is also in that same source. And you see a little bit where they get the data from. So the hotspot database gets external sources, especially these international databases. And it is a one-time, and then you have to wait for a new update. But RepRisk is a continuous real-time monitoring. Datamaron is also close to that. So you get a little bit of insights in what all these tools do. Again, a bit frustrating because you probably don't have the budget to buy any of them. Maybe the hotspot database of PTILCA, but we'll come back. They're also not for free. They're actually not cheap at all. So that's the situation. Next. Oh yeah, and that is also where to find what. That's also a table from the handbook, chapter 3. And you can see these are on the vertical scale are all the social topics we have defined. And then you see the crosses that at least something is there. It doesn't always, a cross does not mean that everything is there, but at least something is there. So it helps you to guide yourself a little bit. But you can see that, especially on users and small-scale entrepreneurs, there are areas where really nobody has real good data. So there is also a need to do some desk research. Yeah, next. This is an example how BASF is the company who started already in 2005. That's the first time we met and spoke with them. about their internal metrics. And they have really developed a nice procedure. So they say, do I know the company? Then I go to EcoVadis or RepRisk, the two ones we just discussed. So they have specific data on a company. And that's, of course, the best. But if you don't know the company, for instance, we had the example you buy from the London Metal Exchange, you don't really know where it comes from. Or even if you are looking at cacao, you always don't know where it comes from. It can also change from harvest to harvest. That is not always easy. So then you look, do I know the country? Then I have Verifisk Maplecroft that has a country risk score. Now, sometimes you even don't know that. And Shanik already said, well, cacao grows in a certain region, a certain biome, and we pretty much can find out which are the cacao producing countries, so we can make a country mix there. Of course, that's the lowest quality data you can have, but sometimes you have to improvise because it's simply not known, or the stakeholder you're working with is not willing to say anything. So BASF uses this quite on a regular scale. They have whole procedures internal. They have different teams working on this, and they have access to those tools.
And I think I've put in a 5-minute break here. So we'll again.
Okay, the hotspot identification phase. So next slide. In the handbook, we say, well, to go directly into data collection in the full supply chain, that's actually asked too much. What you typically do with environmental LCA, you go direct, I want to collect all the data. What we do in social LCA, we say, let's focus on a few hotspots. So hotspots are areas which are either very potentially very negative, what we just discussed, or maybe very positive. So things that really matter. And the idea is that you put all the efforts in things that matter most. So it is really kind of efficiency thinking. And that's also because we are guided by the companies who want to be careful with the time they spend on these things. So they say, let's first assume a potentially list of hotspots. So we create what we call a long list of life cycle actors, so producers maybe, that need to be assessed. So really a long list. So not very critical. Let's consider what you just did on the slide. Even Sprungli in Switzerland was on that list. What you then do in step 3 is say, okay, now I'm going to verify, is the Sprungli, a chocolate company in Switzerland, really underpaying its staff? So can we quickly identify that? So you do some hotspot identification. And then later you can try to see, okay, if I can't find a reason to take them off the list in the hotspot assessment, I'm going to really find some very specific data about this company. And so that you zoom in, you put the effort sparingly, because it is already so complicated. Don't waste time on things which probably are not very relevant. That's the thinking here. By the way, it's actually also a good idea in environmental LCA. I sometimes see people collecting data on things which don't matter at all. So you have to kind of learning by doing this. Also, your first social LCA, you will be struggling with this because you need to find a kind of, also a little bit intuitive experience on that. Yeah. Next. So we actually had prepared also a quick breakout room here, but we are running a bit out of time because we have very nice discussions. But the idea is, and you already started, is that quickly draw the life cycle. So draw the life cycle for your company. So that's in the middle. So if you you start from your assignment starts with a certain company. That could be Sprungli in Switzerland, but it could also be the chocolate processor. And then you have upstream, as you call it, suppliers. So a tier 1 supplier, and maybe everything is okay. But maybe tier 2 supplier, there is an issue. You imagine that there is an issue. So it's a red box. And then we have tier N. So behind that, we don't expect any issues. again, that very depends on your case. The joint venture could also be a partner for you. It could be then that ultimately it goes to a local community and the smallholders, and we don't really know what's going on there. So we say, okay, there's probably an issue. And that's the way to organize your hotspot identification phase. Also, sorry, I said downstream, upstream was what I was talking about. So downstream, you look at the user and the end of life, and you try to identify if there are hotspots there. And this is just a random picture, but it is useful to start to draw your picture really at the beginning of your LCA and try to just write some notes around it where you suspect issues and things you want to verify. That creates also your curiousness to certain suppliers. Yeah, is that clear? And what we developed is actually, it's not from us, it is from an early project with the chemical industry. That was almost a parallel project that has stopped, but they had 3 good questions. So we said, does the process occur in a country where human rights violations occur frequently? If that's yes, then it is likely to be a hotspot unless you find that the company is really doing its best to do it different. So some time ago, we worked with a case from textile, from cotton from Turkey. Well, it's quite obvious, even if you read the papers, that there are issues there because there's a lot of Syrian immigrants there. They have no rights. But then we looked at the specific supplier, and they had actually a great website explaining what they were doing, what their commitments were, what others were saying about it. So at least you start to doubt whether they are so bad. But the first check is, okay, is the cotton coming from Turkey? There could be an issue. Then, is the product known to present social risk? So in mining is obvious that there's a health safety because by definition it's dangerous to work in a mine. Things can go wrong there. Then there's also an issue if there are many, the structure of the supply chain is important. So if there is many small-scale subcontractors or small-scale farmers, there is a reason to think, I should check that because they are usually not so well organized, not protected by law. Sometimes they are usually in a weak negotiation position. So it's better to check that. So that can help your thinking a little bit to identify the case, because we should have given these questions earlier when you do the hotspot identification, but it was also good to do your own thinking about that. Yeah. Of course, this is just a kind of intuitive way to get a bit further. Yes, next. Yeah. Yes, Stanley.
Yes, so sometimes there is maybe even an organization maybe formed by the government, like let's say in Ghana, there is this board of agriculture. Maybe this board might sort of organize farmers into some structures, and then this board might also be responsible for actually underpaying the farmers. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
The government itself becomes a problem instead of helping people. It underpays to actually meet its own maybe costs of running like day-to-day operations.
Yeah, no, that is a good example where there's actually indeed a very confusing situation. You think you were hoping the government were doing something good, and in fact they aren't. You see that also in some socialist countries that there is officially a union, but the union has nothing to say. So you think they are well organized and they have they can speak up and make demands, but it isn't happening. There's a lot of corruption in many organizations, also of course in the West. We have to be very careful about these things. So it requires critical thinking indeed.
It's also covered a little bit under the fair trading and collective bargaining topic. the level of negotiation and level of influence that each stakeholder has. So under that situation, how much influence do they have over their own position, or should they be treated like a worker in that situation?
Yeah. The better examples are when farmers have organized themselves in a cooperative. Still, cooperatives can also be run very badly, or one powerful person takes all the money. But the fair trading organization usually work with cooperatives. And we have also looked at a case of for coffee with Nestle, and they had data of about 11,000 coffee farmers in a certain area, and they monitored that quite well, and still found things which were going wrong, but then they tried to adjust it. But yeah, so these are a good example where you think that something is going well, but in fact it may not go well. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now, so you asked us to talk about the social hotspot database. To be quite frank, in our network, the companies don't use it. Let's do a warning first. And I'll explain a little bit some of the issues we're having. And I have a bit of a double interest here, because in principle, it's a CIMA Pro product and we should be promoting it, but we also have honestly some doubts. In fact, there are two of these databases. I will not go too much detail, but they are based on input-output database, and I'll explain later what it is. And they are really focusing on identifying risk, very little about positive impact. So the negative part of the scale, so the -1 and -2. They try to make a quantified indicator. So far we talked about the qualitative indicator. Initially, somebody mentioned the hotspot. There's also type 2 and a type 1. The type 2 in the UNEP guidance is the quantitative method. They do calculate a quantitative method, but they use a kind of trick for that. So they look at the risk you have per working hour. So if you work 10 hours under a low risk, or 100 hours under a high risk, that could be something similar in their view. It works quite well for workers and local communities, but less for local communities and small entrepreneurs, because we don't know much about how many hours they use. But for workers, it works quite nicely. And what is also important to understand, that although the system is developed to have data per economic sector, per country, it basically is data per country. Now, next one, pushing. So this is a bit how input-output database is structured. Every economy nowadays has such a table. And what they do, they see, okay, agriculture sells, and this is a very simple example, just as if the country has 3 economic sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. And the agriculture sector supplies to agriculture, supplies to industry and services. Next. But it also exports and sells to consumers, and then you can look at the total agricultural sales. That's one line of the matrix. Then, of course, industry also sells to agriculture, also to industry, and also to services, and also exports, and also sells to consumers. And the same for services. So that is the way you can summarize an economy, a national economy. You can also then see, okay, but there are also imports. And then there is also there's also taxes, and there's labor costs. I left that out. But this is a very easy way to describe a whole economy. Now, usually there are not 3 sectors, but 25 till sometimes even 1,000 sectors. Some economies, some countries have a very detailed input-output table. Yeah. The trick is, what we have done is to add emissions, resource use, and social impacts per euro value generated. So if we sell €1 from agriculture to industry, we know the social impacts per euro for an agricultural product. And then, so we can then see if you have an industrial product, what the share of agriculture is. But the other trick is that we combined those national tables, or not, we didn't do it, but some people did that, to tables with other countries. So they look at the imports and the exports and they link these things to each other. So you create a world economy table with that. Next. Now there are two versions. Silka, that is developed in Germany. And it uses a certain type of input-output database, EORA, which is a bit different from the hotspot database. The difference is in the number of countries, the number of sectors. I will not go too much in detail on that because it's a bit too much to remember. But for instance, and one thing is that they have sometimes only 26 sectors. For instance, this is Afghanistan. And if you are able to see it, there's only one sector called agriculture. So all the agriculture products are having the same social impacts in that database. If you go to the next indeed, then you have UK, they have 511 industries, so much more detailed. Agriculture is split up into many different types. We found it interesting that they even have something called bookbinding as an economic sector, which shows that the British are quite traditional in the thinking because there's nothing on the internet, for instance. So the statistics are usually a bit behind, but this is a bit of a side remark, of course. But the issue is that for the UK, in that database, you would have quite detailed data, specific social impacts for the economic sector of bookbinding, or banking, or bacon and ham production, which is also a sector there. Yeah. Then they have not the same number of social issues that we have. They have, in fact, 69 different, 69 indicators, and they have summarized that in 25 subcategories, but they are not the same as we have. So that's a complication when you start working with it. Let's not go into too much detail here. Yeah, one important thing is that is both in Silka and in Social Hotspot database. So what they do, they have per country a certain risk level, a certain risk that there is child labor, a certain risk that there's discrimination. And then they multiply that risk by the number of hours used in a certain sector to create $1 of value, or €1. Yeah, so they say if you have many working hours under a certain risk level, we can multiply this number of working hours by that risk level. Now, they calculate the working hours with these formulas for each sector. There's statistic data on that. So they say the working hours are the unit labor cost divided by the mean hourly labor cost, and the unit labor costs are then calculated by the compensation divided by the gross output. But that is a bit of economic thinking here. Yeah. If I go too fast, let us know. So then we look at an indicator. Again, this is Silka, but it's very similar for the Social Hotspot database. Here they have a definition. He said children working in children in employment, referring to children involved in economic activity for at least 1 hour or in the reference week of the survey. And they have now said how many hours of work in a week are, or what percentage of hours are used by children. And they say if it is 0, there's no risk. If it is between 0 and 2.5%, they call it very low risk, which we in the industry group say, hey, that is strange. We would call it a very high risk because we don't want any child labor in our work. And they call if a 20% share of children is working, a very high risk. And in Psilka, it's interesting that no data is actually not punished very much. It is a low risk. So here we are struggling a little bit ourselves what to do with this. But the trick is that they multiply this 1 or 0.1 or 0.01 with the number of working hours, and then they create the risk. You get a quantitative indicator. Is this somewhat clear? Or am I going too fast?
Yeah, how is the age-wise when you say the child?
Sorry?
Can you repeat?
The age-wise, I mean, when we say children involved in economic activity up to, I mean, 18 years or
It's
what is the year?
14 years.
They use 7 to 14 in this case. But it's interesting because the ILO often talks also about 16. So there are some different definitions. And in the ILO, they also distinguish between light child work, which is maybe not that bad. During harvesting, it would be strange not to help your parents a little bit, but it could also be dangerous one, like working in a mine, where your health is also affected. So you're not only going to school, but also in this database, they don't, in Psilka, they make a difference, I think, between harmful and not harmful. I have to look it up. Yeah, but so definitions do play an important role. Also in our handbook, we have such definitions. Yeah, so that is a way to calculate that. Social hotspot database does something very similar. They use another database, GTAP, that's a US-based database. It's also a global input-output model. They only have 75 sectors, but like in Psilka, they had sometimes 26 sectors, like in Afghanistan, and sometimes 511. Here they have standardized them all to 75, 57 sectors. They have more countries, I believe, 140 regions, but they capture more or less the whole economy. And what they have done, they have also a kind of worker hours model, which helps you then. So this is the illustration of what I just explained. The global input-output model tells us how much turnover, how much value added there is in the sector. Then there's a working hours model that says how many dollar per hour are spent, and then you calculate the risk per hour, risk hours. What the social hotspot database does nicely is that they not only have 69 separate indicators, which are difficult to interpret, but they also put it in 5 categories, or impact categories, they call it. So that is labor rights and decent work, human rights, health and safety, governance, and community. And plus also contribution to economic development. So that's their framework for assessing the topic. So you can work on the very different, all the 160 indicators. So they have 160 indicators, but you can group them, fortunately, so that you don't get 160 scores out something. They have similar skills, also not always working with a factor 10. So that's also a question, of course, who has decided that low risk and medium risk should differentiate a factor 10? That is relatively intuitively done. There's not real good science behind that, or actually no science, you could say. And they have a little bit different than Psilka, but similar thinking of this. Yeah, and then they have also done that for agriculture and forestry. They have different scales. And they have for some other sectors also different scales. So, but that's a little bit too much detail maybe. Oh, I should have changed that slide. There is also a web-based tool, but unfortunately the colleague who has the password is on holiday, and I couldn't find the password anymore. But there is a relatively low-cost option, which you maybe as a university can do generally, and go to them and ask access to the web-based tool. And there you can see per country, per topic, what the scores are. So you don't see a whole supply chain, but you see it per sector and per country. So if you have an idea of how the supply chain works, you can actually find the data there. If you look very carefully, you see that actually Ghana is not in that one because, oh, no, sorry, it doesn't mean that. No, sorry. Ghana is a different color, but I forgot what it was. But that is a relatively low-cost option to access data. Now, you can also use CIMAPRO for that, and you get pictures like these. And now maybe it's good to switch to the CIMAPRO user interface itself and start to look at that. Are there any questions so far before we do that? So I have, as I said, a bit double feeling about it. It's kind of pioneering approach, so it's easy to criticize the pioneers. I have also my criticism around it, but it is also courageous that these two initiatives at least try to make something like a social LCA database. But I will not say it is very perfect at the moment. And there's actually recently a new version was released, and next week we'll be in Aachen where we'll see some introduction of that session. There's a social LCA conference in Aachen, as you may know, next week, where a lot of people meet around this area.
Just a quick question, maybe regarding this database, that CIMAPRO database. How far is the development or the usage? For example, is there some publications based on this data, or just still under development, or regarding the standardization? How far you developed it?
No, the hospital database is actually quite old. It's already, I think, almost 10 years on the market. It got updated a few times. And PSILCA is about 5 years old, I would estimate, or maybe 7. And maybe, oh yeah, maybe a few slides and you can see also the pricing of it. If you click a few slides further. Yeah. This could have been updated by now by the new version, but the ballpark figure is the same. So you see that the hotspot database on the lower left is depending on what kind of organizations you are. So there is a multiple academic question depending on which type of country you are from. Unfortunately, Sweden is probably in definitely in the OECD countries. So you would have to pay about $5,000 for a license and then a maintenance fee, which would give you automatic updates. PSILCA is in the same order of magnitude. Yeah, the academic single user is 3,000. The simplest version, they have 3 levels of granularity. And the academic faculty user 6,000. So it's all about in the same ballpark figure. And the risk mapping tool is much cheaper. It is, I have to look, 700, no, for academics.
This one in CIMAPRO, that means in addition to the environmental life cycle analysis database. The cost is only for the social database.
Yes, correct. So that's why if you don't have CIMA-Pro, the risk mapping tool is maybe a very interesting proposition. And for the academic, it is.
For the academics, it's 350.
Yeah, 350. And if it is not in a non-OECD country, it's only 50, isn't it?
150.
150 per year. Yeah. Yeah. So that is maybe the best way. Having said that, what we really find most companies do, although they even have tools, desk research should certainly not be overlooked. You can find so many things on the internet on what a specific company is doing, or you can also go to NGOs like fair trade organizations. They have a lot of data on specific companies, or the slave labor organizations, forced labor organizations, they have reports about countries, about sectors. So there is also a lot out there, and maybe even better than what you find in the hotspot database, more detailed and more recent. And don't forget, I started the slide with, in the social topics report, we have a number of sources which are also accessible for free. You just click on the link and you get a good impression. So I'm not sure if you should do the first thing you do is buy CIMA-Pro, and so I should have said that, but for myself, personally interested would be good if you do that, but honestly, to get started, maybe do some desk research, maybe the risk mapping tool, use the tools which we provided in the hotspot in the topics report.
Is there free trial at the beginning before paying for that? That kind of option?
No, not for a hotspot database. Not for CIMA-Pro. We have something, but then in the free trial you have standard data in. So no social data in that.
Okay.
But I really recommend you also for your own learning experience, looking at your own desk research. That's really a very good way of learning. If you immediately dive into a software tool, you also get distracted by the software tool. Let me briefly show the software tool also.
Yes, I think that's a good segue into the demo of the software tool. So I'll stop also sharing.
Yeah, and then I'll start sharing. Where's my share? This one. And sorry, I already had a calculation. Okay, can you see my screen clear enough?
Yeah.
So this is CIMA-Pro, because I see there the wrong screen.
Yes. No, I can see it. So, so this is my, I think.
That's your computer. Yeah. Sorry, this is on our own monitor. So, if for those who don't know CIMA-Pro, this is always difficult to demonstrate because there's so many details in a software interface that you can get easily lost. But what's important, there is something called processes in the inventory. And here we have countries, this is a hotspot database. And here I have Ghana, we're talking about chocolate. And then we look at which sectors do they have in Ghana. Let me first hide the thumbnails because they're in the way. And then I can scroll a bit and see, okay, these are the sectors they have in the hotspot database. They're always the same. And let me get rid of this bar also, standing in the way. So they have something called, it's just alphabetical, air transport, animal products, beverage, tobacco, etc. So you have to go a little bit through finding where then chocolate would be, if we take that example. And then we see here, fortunately, vegetables, fruits, and nuts, but we don't have chocolate as such. So here you have the first issue that this input-output database groups similar economic activities in the same box, basically. So you have an aggregation problem here. Yeah. Now, if I would look at what is the data here, I make a big screen. Okay, I say the output is vegetable nuts, it is $1. That is my reference. And what do I need to produce $1? Then I see, oh, I need chemical, rubber, and plastic. I import that. It's actually very little. It is less than 0.7 cent. Metal production coming from Australia. Vegetables and fruit from China. Hey, apparently there is some import from China to Ghana. Crops from China. So there are a few things from China, very small amounts. So usually they don't show up, you don't need, but it's actually interesting. It gives you the whole trade statistics. I have also some motor vehicles from Japan. So apparently those are the transport vehicles, the Toyota's trucks they use, and chemicals and rubbers, because these need also, of course, tires. And so you can go through and you see a long list of imports, and by far not all interesting, but sometimes they are dominant. Usually it is E-3. So it's quite an impressive long list, and this is automatically generated. Fortunately, nobody put that in by hand, which you shouldn't try even. And then we go a little bit lower. So these are all those. Oh, South Africa is also a supplier. You see ferrous metals, metal products, motor vehicles. So apparently, if the Toyotas break down, they get them from South Africa, or the parts. Yeah, then they have emissions, and there's no environmental information here. And then they have access, risk of urban, let me scroll a little bit, of risk of no urban access to improved source of drinking water, and they call that a medium risk, and there is a certain risk level. And these are risk level per working hours. And here you see something strange. They all are the same, because the risk level is countrywide, but the working hours determine, so this is actually risk level plus the number of working hours in the sector nuts in Ghana. So that's why they're always the same here. That looks intuitively very strange, but if you start to combine all the supply chains, then it makes sense, because if you import African motor parts, you will see other working hours there, and then also other risk levels. Yeah. Now you see something else, something a bit annoying, that there are indeed many social topics which they all have a risk level for. Let's take a risk of low life expectancy, risk of gender inequality by sector based on the position in the workforce, over a risk of gender inequality. So they have it's quite a lot of detail, and that all comes from international statistics sources, and that's in fact the same sources as we put in the social topic report, the ILO, the World Health Organization, etc. They all collect such numbers. This is somewhat clear. At the moment, I cannot see, and I can see it on my other laptop. Yeah.
Can you scroll up to the top? So now here we see the work hours.
Yeah.
At the beginning, we started with dollars.
Yeah.
Is this one? Yeah, I don't know. The 2 units. How do we interpret it?
So the first part. So the first part, which is under inputs here, is all the trade relations this sector has. And the trade relations are not in kilograms, but in dollars. So to make $1, you need to pay your salary and you need to do your things, but then you also need to buy, apparently, this sector on average buys chemical, rubber, plastics from Australia. Not sure why, but that's what the statistics tell us. Later, yeah? Okay, Dalia.
Yes, the unit is US dollar 2002. What is meant by 2002?
Yeah, that is because we have inflation, and the new version, I know it's been updated to, what was it? I forgot. So this is a bit old dollar value. That is also disturbing. And especially when you do trades to countries with high inflation rates, then you get disturbances. Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
Is there a means to adjust it, for example, to, I mean, in discounting or
Yeah,
yeah, so that kind of factors maybe
you
in
could
the system.
you could try it. I'm not sure if it's worth the effort. We also in SimaPro do it because SimaPro can convert it to euros if you want, but then it needs to know to which euro of which year. So that's why we have a unit per year. You can also wait till the update comes, and then you already have a much more recent dollar value. It's one of the uncertainties. There's quite some uncertainties in all this data, so maybe not focus directly on that one, I would say. Yeah. Now that is what's in the data. Now SimaPro does something with it, and that's what we put under methods. And we have a method with it. And in that method, we have something called characterization. Because what we want to do, we want to aggregate child labor, all these topics about child labor. So on the right-hand side, you see the indicators, or sorry, in the, on the left-hand side, you see a number of groups, so impact categories, so more aggregated levels, much more understandable. So child labor actually has then four, in the database, you will find child labor, very high risk, child labor, medium risk, child labor, low risk, child labor, high risk. And here you maybe recognize the table we just showed, that they multiply the number of working hours with these factors to calculate the score for child labor. They do the same for forced labor. They accessing working hours, let's take another one. So they have these kind of grouping. And that's a way to have all these different values into a single score per topic.
We have a raised hand.
Yes, Priscilla.
Yeah, I was just wondering how easy it is to bring this to SimaPro. When do I need a specific session for this, or could I, if I bought the extra for having the social, can I import it to my already existing system, let's say?
Yeah, if you have a SimaPro license, you could import it. I'm not sure if it's wise to do it. I keep it separately because the name nomenclature is so different. It could also be confusing to import it. You could also simply switch. You have under file, you have an option to go to another database. So open a SimaPro database and then you open it.
So
that means we need.
For now,
okay.
You can't have the environmental and the social sort of together.
Well, you can do it, but so in the eco event, for instance, there is no social, and in here there's no environmental, unfortunately. Okay. No. Now that's a pity. They have no environmental data. Yeah. Okay, but let's then look at some results. Now I go back to where we were. So this is the method. And now the fruits and vegetables. And now I start to calculate, and that takes a little bit of time. Not too bad. Zulka is a bit slower. And my computer is, I'm using my old computer because I hadn't installed this in my new computer, but it's still pretty fast. So what it does now, it loads all the data. It traces all these imports. So it says, okay, I want to know nuts in Ghana, but I also want to know these imports from South Africa and what's behind that. So we'll see later that there is a whole network, a whole process tree of substances. So it's already now calculating 6,000 processes, and the counter is still, oh, it stops at 6,000. And now it does all the calculations. And now it should give a result. Normally I get something here. Oh, it's still, my computer is still making noise. So apparently the fan is. Or am I in the wrong window?
I'm curious how many of you already use LCA or SIMA Pro, and if there is actual interest in implementing after this session the social hotspot database in your research. Okay, it's loaded.
Yeah, it's loaded. So, bit confusing. Well, maybe very confusing. I don't know. I'll zoom in a little bit. So what SIMA Pro does, it has here vegetables and nuts in Ghana. And what is remarkable here, and this is the total score of all the impacts. They have a weighting system for that. And you see here that, as I didn't notice that before, that they have a lot internal traits. So you see an arrow going out and an arrow going in on the bottom. So that is a very dominating effect. This is about labor rights and decent work. I can also go to characterization, and I can also say, okay, what about child labor? That's one you had, and then I need to recalculate it then. And by the way, I forgot to say, underneath you see all these, the most important trading relations. So you see that some raw milk is brought in, some chemical rubber is being brought in, some oil seeds are brought in, cereal grains are, and some animal products are being brought in. So that is all inputs to that sector. So during your LCA, you can eat a lot of chocolate while waiting. Oh, Dalia.
This is very interesting, Mark. Thank you for sharing. I'm wondering about the uncertainty. In environmental LCA, we have an uncertainty analysis. Is there something similar in social LCA?
Actually, not really, because we have these working hours, but there is nobody specified an uncertainty on the working hours, neither on the risk levels. So we don't have that. And that's why you have to be careful. The uncertainties are really high, because you can just the way they calculate, so they say a high risk level is a factor 10 and a low risk level is a factor 1. So who actually decided that factor 10? Then these working hours are just statistical data, and they are for the whole sector, not specifically for cacao. So there's a lot of uncertainty factors. So the what I always say, it is uncertain, but it's better than knowing nothing. So it's a kind of halfway what you can learn from it. So you should be really critical and not only, and I've seen some people focus only on the LCA on this database and write a whole report about it. And I will be very careful doing that, because there is much more you need to consider.
So in this database, sorry if I can.
No, fine.
If I can talk, yeah. Is it so all of the data country based, or for example, if you consider the global or yes, global supply chain? In that case, how can we handle if there is no product-based database?
Well, so that is an issue. So if you, so the link to product is that this is about producing fruit and vegetables in Ghana. and then you see the supply chain, but different from what you're used to in an environmental LCA, because you don't see kilograms, you see only dollars, because that's the linkage. So it's kind of follow the money idea is behind this. Yeah, so
yeah, and the difference, I suppose, is for environmental, it's a specific product where you might have some primary data from the companies that supply to you, and maybe some background databases that you use for further away in your supply chain. But here, this is really all background data. So it's all these input-output based databases that use revenue as the first trade exchange ideal. And then you assume that my chocolate bar sits within this industry in Ghana. And yeah, but it's that follow the money kind of path. And
yes, I mean, my question is not specific to this vegetable from Ghana. For example, if we export fish product from Norway to China, is that the same? I mean, do we base our data or analysis based on the information from Norway, the database, or is there a product based, or I don't know if it is underway? That is
no, but that's a nice example, because the problem with the example in Ghana is that all the impacts appear to happen in Ghana, so it's not really showing much. I'm not sure if fisheries are in, I thought it was, yeah, fishing in Norway. So catching the fish and processing it, we have that. So if I do the same calculation here and wait a little bit, we are a little bit over time, if you don't mind.
okay.
I'll have some time. Do you have time still? Yeah. Then we have to wait again for the calculation. But so you can do that, and you could even add the air transport from Norway to China in that way, because there's also social data on air transport. The question is then, if it's a Norwegian company, then you use Norwegian air transport, or if it's a Chinese one. Air transport is a bit difficult because it's between two countries, but you can add that to your, or keep them separate, so you can study them separately, both.
Yes, that is interesting. In the case of life cycle analysis, we create our own product, and then all the chains we can create. If that is possible in this case, or
yeah,
also,
you can.
That was my question actually. To create the whole supply chain and then run it.
Yeah, you can create your own process linking to the different. So if you would then collect data on the number of dollars spent to fishing, to transport, maybe to packaging, that's another sector. So it's all in dollars then, or euros. Then you can create a new process developing that. So hopefully there is a little bit more differentiation in this one. I never did this before. Fishing in Norway. It's a bigger one. You see already 12,000 processes are needed for this.
Yeah, okay.
Oh yeah, here this is a bit more interesting example, because here you can actually see some hotspots. So you can see that this is for child labor. That is on the bottom up. You see there are some food products in tobacco. I'm not sure why tobacco is an important. Well, maybe the fishermen smoke a lot, but I don't know exactly why that is. And then there are crops going to the tobacco. If you can follow my nose and mouse, you can see the mouse. Yeah. And there's also plant-based fibers that go into textiles. That's for nets, which is a bit strange. I thought I was just explaining that it was all nylon, so I'm not sure. And there is bovine, so there is also meat going into, and that is for the farm fishing. And there's vegetable oils going in that has some impact. So these percentages is the relative risk for child labor. And if I would go to health and safety, I would probably get another one. characterization. Where is my injuries and fatalities, maybe? Now it needs to recalculate again. And then the picture changes. By the way, on the lower left, you see that only 12 nodes are seen, while in fact this network contains 6,000 nodes. So we can also zoom out. At the moment it has cut off, you can see in the top, everything that contributes less than 4% is being cut off here to make the picture visible. But I can also change that cutoff so you can see more processes in more detail. But be careful, because after a while it becomes quite unreadable. Yeah. So now we look at the accidents. Now food products is apparently accidents. Again, tobacco and beverages, maybe they also drink a lot. I'm not sure why this is so important. Or maybe they use fluids from this industry to preserve or to package oil and etc. their fishery. Transport equipment is important and commerce is important. And if I want to zoom out a little bit, I can also say, okay, I want to have only everything which is less than 1% contributing, but then I already warned you, then you get a problem. I can take out the lines, but it becomes quite difficult to see where the hotspots are. Yeah, so the 4% or 3% cutoff is not a bad idea in this, so you get focus on things. So if you are interested in what that food product brings, you can also use this button. No, where is it? Yeah, this button, and then you can see, okay, the impact assessment. What are the issues, the normalized issues here for that? Sorry?
Oh, I think we have just someone that is unmuted.
Yeah. So you can also go per process and see what the scores are in commerce or in business services. What are the most important topics? I can also do that on, so there's a lot of screens I can show. You can also look at injuries or toxics or things. It's quite transparent how it works. Yeah, or if I go to the food production, you can then see what are the most important topics. Yeah, but you have to get used to CIMA Pro a little bit, how that works. And fishing itself, of course, also has its own scores. So, with concluding, where I see the position of the hotspot database, I would definitely not advise you to use this as the single source. It could help you at best, I think, to help you to understand where the hotspots are. But sometimes you see quite counterintuitive approaches, like tobacco being an important supplier to fishing. That sounds a bit fishy, you could almost say. There could also be something in the statistics. It's probably not a mistake of the hotspot database, but sometimes the statistics create such strange linkages, which we have never completely understood where they come from. So you should be really careful to use it, but it helps you to find hotspots. But at the same time, you saw already in your short exercise that you are also able to do hotspots about your intuition, looking at some reports, maybe Amnesty International, the anti-slavery NGOs, World Health Organization statistics. So that can also help, and definitely also the idea to use the hotspot database online tool, which is nicely done and quite up to date also. So that is a bit of my advice here.
Yes, and I think Mark always says this, that especially with social impact, we're looking for a direction. So it's a bit of a compass. It's not an exact route and map for you to find your destination, but we are at least looking to provide some direction. So we always use the analogy that if a plane is 2 degrees off from its original trajectory, that it would be going to a completely different country. And actually, we're looking to get an accurate compass measurement and look for where we can direct our focus. So that's really what social impact is about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is, we've come to the end of our session now.
Yeah, but final comments is fine with me.
Yes, please.
Final questions. I think I'm not sure if we have agreed that on the contract, but it's fine if you send some emails. It's actually very important that you become member of our community, because there you can also have people helping each other, and it's for free. And you're very welcome to join there. We just started, it's not very active yet. We also have the possibility to create a working group. You can even create your own working group for this team, so that you can continue to help each other and share results. So that's also a facility we can offer. And writing an email, I'm sometimes having too many, then I'm a bit slow, but I can try. Or Shanik is also very able to answer such questions.
Yes, and I think I've just sent an email around with the course slides, as well as some links to the website where you can find the handbook and the social topics report, as well as a few case studies we've worked on, and then also a link to the community website that Mark just mentioned. So yeah, we definitely encourage that.
You mean you are sharing the community website also, so that we can register, or?
Yes, so I've sent that in the email as well. Also should be in your inbox.
Yeah.
That is good. Yeah, it is very interesting, and I think it is just under development. So maybe there are a lot of research activities going on, as we are public university, and there is a lot of interest in social life cycle or social assessment in general. I think we can contribute a lot, but I don't know how far you are available. If we use this tool and then want some support, sometimes that will be very good.
Yeah, of course, we only have 25 hours in a day, so we are limited, but especially when you have good ideas or really interesting question, which is also a challenge for us, we're happy to look at that. And bring that's also why we built that community, that it creates a kind of inspiration place to inspire each other also. And that is not only in our hands, but it becomes a community effort, this whole social LCA development. Yeah. We don't want to own it. Was Stanley having somebody?
Stanley, I think she had a comment or question.
Yeah, mine is a quick question. So where is the conference, the Social Life Cycle Assessment Conference?
In Aachen, in Germany, close to the Dutch border in the south of the Netherlands.
Actually, Shanik, she sent the website. You can check it on the chat.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Yes, and we'll actually both be sharing some insights also from working in the product social metrics roundtable, and then having a community meeting as well with some of our partners while there. Yeah.
We're actually also just inviting people to come to a 5 days or 5 sessions hour. So we now made a short version of the training. There's also, we're developing a more extensive training, which will cover many things which you covered here. But then we have a bit more time to have more exercises and to work on that. But now I think you have seen the essence of what you need to know. And I have the impression you are smart enough to further develop your thoughts and to read the handbook and use that as a guidance also, and think for yourself. That's always better than thinking as we would have done it.
Thank you so much, Mark and Shanek. Really, it was very, very interesting. We learned a lot. And yeah, on behalf of my colleagues, really, thank you for your time, your effort, and your patience with us. We have been engaged in so many discussions and questions.
Oh, that was great. That's why we like giving training. So it's much better than telling a long story all the time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. For being
Thank
so
you.
engaged
Bye-bye.
and sharing so
Bye
much.
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, my colleagues. We have on the 7th, the second day for the environmental life cycle assessment. So looking forward to see you there.
Yeah. Dalia, I'm not sure if I have registered for that one or not. Can you check in the table?
You already have the link. I'm sure you are welcome to join. If you haven't, yeah, send me an email. I will send you the link.
Yeah, and thank you, Dalia, for arranging this session.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank
Looking
you.
forward for the next one.
Me too. Have a nice weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Bye bye, guys.
Yeah. Bye.